Okay, welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. We are moving on to item B on our work session agenda. That's the presentation on our English standards of learning. And Dr. Sorensen, you and your team are going to be presenting this, correct? All right, come forward, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam President. Board of Education members, thank you for having us here this afternoon for the presentation discussion around the draft 2024 English Standards of Learning. I'm going to do the introduction slide, and then I'm more than happy to introduce the very capable and competent team that I work with that has done an incredible lift to engage the community and engage the Commonwealth in the process of looking at the 2017 standards so that we could bring you a draft of the 2024 standards. So what I want to put in front of the board first is the recommendations from the 585 work group, just to remind the Board of Education and the public of the cycle of standards review. And so I wanted to put that in front of the Board of Education to just remind us that we are on pace with the recommendations of the 585 work group in terms of revising the English language arts standards. So we're here in front of you for first review, and then hopefully we'll be back in March for final approval after we get stakeholder engagement over the next couple of months. So I again wanted to put that in front of us as a reminder of the 585 work group's recommendations. I think what you'll find here comprehensively is that the English language arts standards are a major overhaul. There is great work that has been done in alignment with the Virginia Literacy Act to ensure that we are fully aligned with evidence-based practices in the science of reading, that our standards are more rigorous and robust, that we lean into writing in a way that our standards did not before, that we lift up disciplinary literacy, strong text complexity, stamina in our readers, and we ensure that our kids are engaged in all genres of text so that they come out prepared, not only for post-secondary careers, but for the workforce in front of them. This has been quite a journey of love for our team. We hit the Commonwealth as well as our institutes of higher education that the team will tell you more about in a very robust way over the past year, so that we could bring you this draft of standards. And so to my right, I want to introduce the team that really dug into this work with our educators, with our folks in institutes of higher education, and with multiple stakeholders at various levels across the Commonwealth. So I will let them present their work to you. I will introduce Christine Harris, who is our Director of Humanities, and I have Jill Nagaris, who is our K-12 Coordinator of Literacy, and then also Colleen Casada, who I will call up here to do the presentation for you. But we look forward to the feedback from the board. We look forward to the feedback that we'll receive over the next couple of months from the public through the public engagement hearings that will follow in the 8 regions across the Commonwealth, and we look for a robust engagement process with stakeholders across the Commonwealth over the next couple of months so that we bring you back a product in March that everyone can be more proud of, that we can build upon throughout this process. So thank you.
Good afternoon, Madam President, Superintendent Coons, members of the board. Thank you so much for hosting us this afternoon, for the opportunity to discuss the standards of learning with you. My name is Jill Nogaris, as Dr. Sorensen said, and I am joined today by my wonderful colleagues in the Office of Humanities, and they have done the lion's share of the work in bringing this draft to you today. And we are really excited. We represent a much larger group of educators, institutes of higher education, work groups, Commonwealth employees, business members, military members, advisory boards. This is the work of many, 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 many stakeholders over the last year. And we are excited to present this first draft of the 2024 standards to you all. I know that you are following along on your computers, so I will let you know that I am going to quickly give you an update and quickly review the guiding principles that are included. I know you all have a paper copy of the English Standards of Learning in front of you. I know it's also in your board docs, however it is you're looking at that. But before we dig into the work of the revisions to the 2017 standards, I want to quickly review the guiding principles that are here, because I think you are going to find that they are embedded in the standards all throughout and have guided the work and kind of what we hope for the future of the Commonwealth. So just looking at these guiding principles, you have that we are looking to inspire learners to embrace the joy of unlocking new knowledge, worlds, and experiences through the standards, raise the floor and remove the ceiling for our students, ensure that every child is reading by third grade on or above grade level, prepare every graduate to be an effective communicator, teach reading based on research and embrace the science of reading, strengthen foundational skills, prioritize strong research, analytical, and synthesis skills, ensure students demonstrate competency with reading, writing, discussing, and presenting a broad selection of both informational and literary texts and books, expose students to a wide variety of genres, authors, and great works prior to graduation, utilize technology and artificial intelligence as tools for teaching and learning around the ELA standards, but also as a topic of instruction in a safe, ethical, and responsible manner, and to use judgment and a transparent process to ensure materials and topics are developmentally appropriate. So these guiding principles are demonstrated and embedded throughout the K-12 standards, and just kind of wanted to call your attention to those. But in looking at our presentation, I guess we're now on slide 4. If you're following along at home or with us here up on, I guess we're calling this the dais, we'll go with it. As you are aware, the Code of Virginia requires a review of standards at least once every 7 years. With the last English standards adoption in 2017, we are on schedule to adopt revised standards in 2024. The 2023 Virginia Literacy Act legislation fleshes out more specifically the expectations for English standards in the Commonwealth, requiring that the standards of learning for reading in kindergarten through grade 8 shall align with evidence-based literacy instruction and science-based reading research. Additionally, with direction from leadership and the board, our revision process moved forward, focusing on the engagement and feedback of a variety of stakeholders, raising academic expectations for students and schools, developing skilled readers to ensure that students are equipped to access educational experiences that prepare them for post-secondary opportunities, and create clear and coherent academic standards that will allow for common expectations of mastery in the Commonwealth. Moving on to slide 5, the English Standards of Learning encompass all grade levels, kindergarten through grade 12. While the English standards provide the essential skills and content to be covered in each grade, school divisions are encouraged to incorporate the standards into division-selected, high-quality instructional materials and curriculum. Slide 6 gives you a little bit of update because since our last presentation to the board in February of 2023, and then the update provided in October of 2023, the English Standards of Learning have gone through a comprehensive revision process. Looking at slide 7, our first charge was to engage with the community to obtain feedback regarding the strengths and challenges of the 2017 standards. So as documented more specifically in your boilerplate, feedback was provided by the Virginia Association of Teachers of English, the Virginia State Literacy Association, the Virginia English Language Arts Supervisors, parents, educators, community members, faculty from institutes of higher education, and business members. 7 community engagement sessions were hosted around the Commonwealth to receive such input. The chart in your boilerplate provides details on the locations, numbers of attendees, and comments collected. From this public comment, several themes emerged across different topics. While addressed in the boilerplate, highlights include the need for an explicit connection between the standards and science-based reading research, an attention to the spiral and build of skills K-12, connecting reading and writing, and clarity on expectations for various writing types. From here, the Virginia Department of Education English team transitioned into revision mode. Looking at slide 9, that gives you an overview. Several key publications were instrumental in shaping the revision of the standards. Referenced on this slide are a number of notable frameworks, standards, legislative requirements, and bodies of research that encompass what's current in evidence-based literacy instruction and professional learning on standards development, revision, and implementation. As detailed in your boilerplate, a revision committee comprised of 52 educators, special education teachers, reading specialists, administrators, and school division English supervisors representing all 8 superintendents' regions met for a week to review public comment, the aforementioned materials, and make recommendations to revisions on the standards. Ongoing revision work was completed by the English Standards Revision Steering Committee, and input was gathered from the English Education Advisory Board. VDOE staff facilitated the revision process and worked to complete a draft set of standards for external review. I would like to thank each group I just mentioned, of which there are many, for their input, and especially the committees for their work in this process. This fall, once we came and developed the draft, the proposed draft of 2024 English Standards of Learning were reviewed by our colleagues at Virginia Literacy Partnerships at UVA, several institutes of higher education, and a national expert. Looking at slide 11, I'm sorry, 13 Virginia 2-year colleges and 4-year universities provided feedback on the proposed revisions to the standards of learning you see today. The participating institutes of higher education are listed on your slide. Additionally, drafts of the elementary standards were provided to Virginia Literacy Partnerships for review and feedback from September through November of 2023. The K-12 draft standards and feedback regarding coherence, clarity, and vertical alignment were shared with a national expert from November to December 2023. Comments and feedback shared with the English Education Advisory Board were shared with them so that they could provide their input, and revisions and adjustments were made, and the result is the draft you have in front of you today. So it has already undergone many iterations to this point. All right, looking at slide 12, the next few slides are going to highlight the changes, the comprehensive changes from 2017 to the draft 2024. So if you're looking at slide 13, you will see our first major change. The 2017 English Standards of Learning were written to include 4 strands of content: communications, reading, writing, and research. While the essential skills from 2017 are still evident in the proposed draft of the 2024 English Standards of Learning, the new standards provide a more comprehensive approach to ensure students are engaging in more rigorous applications of the skills. The 2024 standards are structured to maximize coherence and integration among strands, which will help schools move away from skill of the week instruction and teaching isolated skills to connecting reading, writing, communication, and research with a variety of texts. Following current research and literacy best practices, the proposed 2024 standards are organized utilizing the following 10-strand structure: foundations for reading, developing skilled readers and building reading stamina, reading and vocabulary, reading literary text, reading informational text, writing foundations, writing, language usage, communications, and research. On slide 14, you will notice several notable changes from the most recent set of standards. These include the following: an emphasis on foundational literacy skills. The 2024 English standards are structured to begin with the foundations for reading standards to establish foundational skills at each grade level. Sub-strands included to address these areas include print concepts, phonological and phonemic awareness, phonics and word analysis, and developing skilled readers and building reading stamina. To expand on that a little bit more, the developing skilled readers and building reading stamina, fondly known as DSR, is designed to emphasize several key components of literacy development. DSR addresses the essential components of reading fluency, text complexity, textual evidence, deep reading on topics to build knowledge and vocabulary, and reading strategies. Used to anchor the 2024 English Standards of Learning in grades K-12, Developing Skilled Readers highlights the most critical research and evidence-based elements of literacy. The standards that follow provide the content of meeting grade level expectations in relation to developing skilled readers. And coherence. The 2024 English Standards of Learning are structured to maximize coherence and make essential connections in and between the following strands: foundations for reading, developing skilled readers, reading and vocabulary, reading literary text, reading informational text, writing foundations, writing, language usage, communications, and research. Grade level standards for English must be developmentally appropriate within a grade level and vertically coherent across grade levels to ensure that students continue to build and connect skills at each grade level. The focus of the standards emphasizes conceptual understandings and the integration of skills to provide building blocks from grade level to grade level and spiral K through 12. And text complexity. Following national research, the Virginia 2024 English Standards of Learning also include a section on text complexity within the appendix. Aimed at providing grade-by-grade specifications for increasing text complexity, this tool can be used to measure and provide students with texts that match the rigor, expectations, and features of grade-level reading in order to ensure that students are equipped with the skills necessary for success in higher education, the military, or post-secondary endeavors. Moving into the how to read standards. The 2024 English standards establish foundational skills at each grade level in K through 8 to align with the Virginia Literacy Act and ensure explicit, systematic, and evidence-based literacy instruction for our youngest learners. The substrands included to address these areas are print concepts, phonological and phonemic awareness, phonics and word analysis, and developing skilled readers and building reading stamina. These explicit skills are critical in ensuring that students establish a firm foundation in learning to read so that they can tackle challenging texts and engage in critical conversations at later grade levels. The new structure presents these skills first in each grade level to emphasize the skills readers need in order to tackle more challenging material. The foundations for reading skills target skills that young readers need to develop the pathways to orthographically map words and know words automatically without conscious effort. The next slide provides a sample of the developing skilled readers and building reading stamina standards. These standards are included K-12 and are designed to emphasize the key components of literacy development, addressing reading fluency, text complexity, textual evidence, deep reading on topics to build knowledge and vocabulary, and reading strategies. This strand is intentionally included directly after the foundations for reading and provides an anchored approach to grade level learning in all grade levels. The standards that follow provide more specific details of the expectations for what a student would learn within a grade level when engaging in learning as anchored by this strand. Special attention on slide 18 was given to horizontal and vertical articulation throughout the revision process. This slide provides an example of the intentional and interconnected design. Through the integration of these skills, students are deepening their understanding and analysis through complex processes that cover a range of instructional opportunities and provides teachers the ability to introduce, emphasize, and reinforce concepts and skills necessary for students to become strong readers, writers, communicators, researchers, and problem solvers. The following slide depicts an illustration of the vertical alignment of the standards. This example follows one aspect of reading literary text and shows the deliberate crafting of standards that build in rigor and complexity with actionable and measurable language. While a simple example, all 10 strands have been designed to follow this model and build over the K-12 experience. The remaining slides are going to provide a quick overview of how to read the documents that you have, because we know you're all so excited to read them over the next month and join us on the road. So slide 21 provides for you a side-by-side document that provides the current 2017 English Standards of Learning on the left side and the proposed draft 2024 English Standards of Learning on the right side. Material may appear out of order as the restructuring of the standards shifted content to other areas within a grade level. So if you see a missing letter, it's probably somewhere else within that grade level. Slide 22 is the clean copy that you also now have a hard copy of in front of you. That is the clean copy of the draft 2024 English Standards of Learning. The last section of our presentation provides upcoming important dates and the next steps that we will be engaging in. If accepted for first review, the department will host 10 public hearings across the Commonwealth over the month of February. 6 of these will be held in person and 4 will be offered virtually at a variety of times to accommodate working individuals and families. Feedback will be gathered over the course of February, and any additional updates and/or revisions will be applied. We anticipate, fingers crossed, that we will return for final approval at the March 2024 Board of Education meeting. And at this time, we would be happy to answer any questions you have or accept any feedback you may have.
Dr. Northern?
All right, I think they're phenomenal. Honestly, you guys have done amazing work. I just can't say enough how much improved this draft is from our prior draft or prior. And it's not because our last ones were terrible. It's because the knowledge of science and reading has been so grown and more widely accepted. So I just 4 things just to consider and think about. One is the attention to disciplinary literacy. That was a big, we've evaluated all the standards across the country in ELA. So that's a big thing that I think is not reflected in the draft. So in other words, kids as they get older in middle school and high school need to learn language that's unique to a discipline. So the science language and the concepts of science and history, like every discipline has its own unique jargon and understandings that are unique to that discipline. So I think we could use more attention to disciplinary literacy in the standards, especially in the middle and high school grades. I also think that some of the best ELA standards across the country integrate, this goes back to our prior conversation, the pre-K and the early childhood standards. So especially the pre-K. So if we've already got standards prior to my arrival here that have been approved by this board, to see, because we don't want to forget like the early childhood and the pre-K, right? We don't want to, they're actually part of what we call the K-12 system. So I would think about including the at least the pre-K standards as well, to show that we're starting. I mean, these skills start before K. I mean, you guys know that it's pre-K, it's early childhood. We're starting to teach kids all of these fundamental, letter sounds and all this stuff. So I just think that was one of the suggestions that we made when we reviewed the standards across the country, where that there were a handful of states, Massachusetts was one, I can't remember the other ones, that integrated their pre-K and early childhood. And it just made people pay attention more to those standards if they appeared alongside the K-12 standards. And the other thing I'd push for are text exemplars. We don't want a list. Oh my goodness, we don't want a list of what every kid's got to read in every grade. We just know. But what we would like is, because you guys have spent a lot of time teaching and showing teachers how to figure out what makes a complex text, why not in the appendix provide a list of exemplars from different cultures, different ethnicities, different parts of the world, different time periods for each grade level or grade band, that illustrates what a complex text looks like for those grades. And again, it's not something that would be a requirement, and that's why we actually call it exemplars. This is another thing that really strong standards across the country do. In the appendix, they'll just provide teachers some examples of complex text at each grade level that meet your requirements, so that you spell out on how you should be deciding whether a text is complex or not. And then the last thing, just briefly, is I applaud the inclusion of AI. I think that that's exactly right. Like, we're still trying to figure out what the heck we should be teaching kids about AI, and we know they're going to use it, but so we just need to really teach them like how to use it and the proper ways and how it can, make media bias worse and so on and so forth. I just wasn't able, when I just did an AI search, I kind of lost the thread. So I'm not exactly sure how that worked. I saw it in the guiding principles, but I didn't see it so much in the standards. So that may have been my oversight, but just a better integration of AI, especially in the middle and high school, in terms of what we want kids to be learning about that, because it's changing so quickly.
Thank you.
Other comments or questions? Ms. Holton?
Well, I'll join my colleague in applauding both your process and your outcome. You've put together obviously a really strong a piece of work here. And I appreciate the fact that it's gone through our regular, robust, multi-year process that where you, the staff, have involved a wide community of stakeholders in helping you get it right. And you've just done a phenomenal job. I have a couple of questions, and let me start with how, and I have some sense of the answer, but not enough. How on the K-5 parts of the standards, how much does this go above and beyond the work we've already done with divisions on VLA? In other words, it aligns with, but is there also significant new content that goes above and beyond VLA, or is it basically just incorporating VLA?
So I'll start and I'll let Jill follow up. One of the things I asked the team to do was work side by side with Emily Solari and make sure all of the strands, as Jill went through all of the strands, that the strands that talk about learning to be a reader, all of those strands align directly with anything that Emily Solari and her team have built in training and rollout and those kinds of things. So there was significant coordination around those strands. We know those strands are how to be a reader, but reading text, having the opportunity to hear text, those are things that are different components of ELA that aren't necessarily in the Virginia Literacy Act, so to speak. So it encompasses everything with ELA. But Jill has done a phenomenal job of making sure, both on the pre-K side and the work that we did with pre-K with the Virginia Literacy Act to align, and in the K-5 to work very closely with the VLP and with Emily Solari's team. They took hundreds of comments, hundreds of tweaks, and went through and made sure anything where we used language that was a little bit different to make sure it lined up exactly with the same language that they're putting out with the Virginia Literacy Act. And then Jill, do you want to speak specifically of the strands that are outside in K-5 that talk about more about the developmental exposure to literacy versus the learning to be a reader components?
Sure. I was also going to add, surprise, we're also your VLA team at the department. You may not have known that. We are ELA/VLA. And so we work very closely with everything, all things Virginia Literacy Act. I also wanted to quickly add that in going through the core review, the core materials review that Virginia Literacy Partnerships did on behalf of the department, looking at that K-5 core materials list. If you were to look at the completed rubrics that are all posted, you'll see everything that they were looking for in those rubrics is evident in these standards, because we know that those rubrics would be completed before the standards were. And since we are asking school divisions, to adopt materials and start using these and implementing the Virginia Literacy Act, we needed to make sure that our standards would tightly align with that so that teachers didn't feel like they had competing priorities. But yes, we definitely have all throughout here. And if you look through your draft standards, you will see, especially in the learning to read standards, that you'll have several of them are only in kindergarten, are only in K1. They developmentally kind of phase out as new ideas phase in based on what's developmentally appropriate. So we worked really hard with our partners at Virginia Literacy Partnerships to make sure that we were hitting those things with print concepts and looking at phonological and phonemic awareness, and then moving into phonics and turning that into word analysis, which then morphs into reading and vocabulary as you go up through the grades. So kind of making sure that that happened, but then also on the flip side, making sure that you saw everything in the learning to read standards that are important for the Virginia Literacy Act reflected in the writing foundation standards and also in the language usage standards, because that should be reflected while speaking and while writing and while reading. So making sure that that language acquisition that makes students better readers is kind of evident across a strand and across vertically within, horizontally and vertically within all of the K-5 standards.
So
Ms. Holton?
So I think I understand, I definitely understand that you have aligned thoroughly with VLA, which
Mhm.
doesn't surprise me, partly because you're the same people. I get it, as it should be. And I think I also understand that within the K-5 world that overlaps VLA, these standards also go significantly beyond VLA in some areas.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So the Virginia Literacy Act requires that the reading standards be written a certain way. And because we have the 10 strands now that are looking at, you know, your typical reading, writing, research, and communication, but then expanded to include language usage, writing foundations, literary texts,
Right.
nonfiction text, all of that, it expands beyond the requirements
Right.
of the Virginia Literacy
Right.
Act.
And then so that, and also obviously the 2024, well, let me not assume this. Am I correct from my my rough looking at them, but in layperson, rough, quick look in the upper grades, 6 through 12, these 2024 standards, go significantly beyond the 2017 standards.
Most definitely. They are
Okay, so then that leads to my big question, and this is, Dr. Coons and I've talked briefly about this, but the implementation piece. So I get that you're on schedule for this. We are doing the 2024 revisions when we should be in the regular 7-year cycle. And yet I also hear that you're looking to accelerate the implementation. Now, we usually have what many of us think is an excessive amount of delay essentially between when we adopt standards and when they're implemented. But there is a lot that goes on in that usual, crosswalk year, et cetera. And so now I understand why we want to implement this in congruence with the VLA in the fall of 24, but how are we going to equip? And we're asking so much of our elementary school teachers, especially, but all of our teachers to implement this so quickly. What are the steps that we're going to take to get it? So number one, we would normally be doing curriculum frameworks, and I'm assuming that we haven't heard anything about curriculum frameworks. So I'm assuming that we're not doing those anymore. If we could, what are we doing instead of curriculum frameworks to give teachers a more specific idea of what they're going to be held, they and their students are held accountable for, starting with their teaching in September. So what's substituting for the curriculum frameworks? What are we doing about textbook adoption? What are we doing about assessment rollout so that the teachers really should know by September what their students are going to be assessed on in May? It's not really, and so the VLA piece, I think they do. Because that's been in process, the rollout for quite some time now. But beyond the VLA in the K through 5 grades and for all content in the upper grades, when are we going to let them know what they're going to be assessed on? When are we, the board, going to be setting cut scores? So walk me through from now till, and whether this is you or your colleagues, how are we getting from here to September? And getting all the things that the teachers need done so that they can effectively teach this new, really significant new content in September.
I'm really excited. I can talk to you through September. When it comes to assessment, I'm going to have to kick it over to our assessment counterparts, but I can talk you through instructionally to September. And it's actually something that Colleen and I are very excited about, because we are educators first and foremost. We have students I have a husband who's an educator. We are immersed in education, and we know how important this is for educators to feel like they can do this work. So while we are still in the planning phases, because we don't have completed standards, they need to be approved before we can fully implement anything. Because we also happen to be the VLA ELA team, there is a lot of ongoing and upcoming professional development that is going to be available to school division leaders and literacy teams about preparing for implementation for VLA. As a result, they're going to be thinking about their division literacy plans. They're going to be thinking through their core material selection. They're going to be thinking through supplemental and intervention, what their reading specialists are going to be doing, and what core instruction looks like. There will be additional professional development that school divisions will participate in once they pick their core materials, because there's always support and professional development that goes with high quality instructional materials. So a lot of that is kind of kicking us off as we head into February through May for our K-5 educators. And we have the unique opportunity of piggybacking off of that and getting them in the room to be thinking about K-5 English as well. However, rolling that out and thinking through what's happening through 6 through 12, as soon as standards are approved, we will look at opening and implementing the textbook adoption process. We are also in the planning stages of thinking about professional development on the new standards and what will that look like. Thinking through beginning before the school year even ends, thinking through virtual professional development opportunities that can be ready to go and recorded and just pushed out everywhere that anybody will listen to us. We want to be YouTube stars. That's our goal. But then also making sure that we are in every superintendent's region between June and August to make sure that we can offer professional development to K-12 teachers who will be implementing these new standards. So we are already anticipating that textbook adoption for 6 through 12 will kick off in summer of 2024. Now, as a former middle and high school teacher myself, I can tell you that the majority of textbooks that you're looking at for 6 through 12 are typically anthologies. They are collections of works. And what is so exciting, I think personally, I don't think I'm supposed to have an opinion or be excited, but what is so exciting about English language arts standards is that you can take whatever text you have, whatever you're working on, and you can start implementing these standards right away. They're not text dependent. So while you are looking at adopting new materials and you're looking at expanding and what textbooks will look like in 9th through 12th grade, you can start doing these things, these standards right here with the piece in front of you from Shakespeare or poetry or a speech or an article, because you can start implementing that now. So even if we don't have textbooks ready to go, we can put in professional development in place so that we can get teachers unpacking standards and understanding the new standards. Additionally, we are developing instructional guides. That's the new word, instructional guides. That will help teachers understand the standard and how to approach the new standards as soon as they are approved, so that we can get those. We're going to have a transition team in place. We will also have crosswalk documents similar to those that math had that show where the material has been added, deleted, a grade change, the specifications of what changed within the standards. So we are working on all of those things. They just can't be final, of course, as revisions are still ongoing. If anybody else wants to add.
Ms. Holton, I'll jump in on that in a minute. Oh, y'all, okay,
I'll
go.
just add one thing. Yeah. And thank you for that question. We are prepared to come back to the board in March with a slide or two and an update to compact all of what Jill just prolifically said, because that's a lot to take in, right? So as we talk about the streamlining of our processes, the streamlining of our professional learning, the streamlining of the documents that we've now created, we want to be transparent with the public. We want to be transparent with the board. And we also want people to see that it is methodical, it is coherent, and that it is available in time for our teachers to implement in a way that they feel comfortable with, that they feel supported by, and that they're prepared for the school year. So in March, we will come back and we will show you what that comprehensive plan looks like so that you can see it coherently put together. And then feel free again to give us feedback and ask us questions about the how again. And we're more than happy to reflect and adjust.
Sultan?
Thank you. That's very helpful. And I do think the more detailed presentation in March will be helpful, but I also think you will hear these implementation questions at the public, or you will hear public comment about the implementation questions, I'm sure, in February. So the more you can put out there, the sooner, the better, to help folks know how we're going to make this work on and it's an accelerated basis from what they've come to expect over the years. And even if it makes sense to accelerate it, change is always hard and it's tough to do it as fast as you're talking about. So I'd be interested to know, when are the instructional guides, assuming that we approve these standards? If I understand correctly, the instructional guides is what's going to be the substitute for curriculum framework, or it's going to fill some of the same role as curriculum framework did in the past in terms of letting teachers know at a more detailed level what they're going to be held accountable for when we get to assessment.
Yeah, the instructional guides will fill some of that role. I will also say, the 2024 standards themselves are fleshed out so much more, in providing teachers with what they should be doing within a standard. So kind of fleshing that out and providing more detail. A lot of what lived in the old curriculum framework has been moved into the standards because we knew that teachers would need this right away. So instead of having to look at a document a year later to figure out what it means to talk about persuasive techniques, they are listed up in the standards now so that teachers don't have to wait for that additional support. We wanted to be mindful of that, especially because people don't want to look at 4 different documents to know what they need to do.
Thank you. And if I can just, the textbooks, I get it on the middle and high school, the textbooks may be largely anthologies, as you suggest, and that essentially, I mean, I don't think it's feasible that school divisions are going to be purchasing new textbooks after we've gone through our process in time for September of 2024. But what you're telling me is they'll be okay with the textbooks that they already have, because they're anthologies, they can use the new techniques with the old textbooks, essentially, if I understood correctly. And I get that for middle and high school. And I genuinely don't know the answer to this, but for elementary school, are we still expecting them to be using textbooks in conjunction with their VLA approved curricula? Or does the curricula materials essentially take the substitute? Are they going to have textbooks for elementary school English? And if so, how's that going to happen fast enough?
That's a great question. So as a part of the Virginia Literacy Act, we're moving towards high quality instructional materials. And thanks to the board, we have K-5 approved core curriculum. And so that's what our school divisions will be using as their core curriculum. And so the term textbooks in our K-5 space is high quality instructional materials, and that's what they'll be adopting, if not have already adopted. Some of our school divisions are already ahead on that. And what you will also see from us coming to you in March are the supplemental and intervention materials for K through 8. So you will see those. And so the space in which we will look at supporting our school divisions is 6 through 12 with core. And so again, our standards are such that as people are looking at text complexity and reading stamina, the text that they have in the in-between as we go through a textbook adoption process can still be used as long as they're applying the new standard.
So I just one more follow-up and
Absolutely.
I'll quit.
No,
But as
absolutely.
I get it that the VLA material curriculum material will essentially be in lieu of textbook for the piece that VLA supports, the science of reading. But
No.
As to the materials, as I understood from Ms. Noguera, that ELA does go beyond the reading content in the early grades. And so do the curricula that we've already approved encompass, you know, writing and
Absolutely.
communications and literature. That's all meant
Absolutely.
part of
Yep.
those
Part of
packages.
those K-5 adoptions that the
So
board
once they've
approved.
adopted that curricula, they're not going to need to go back and supplement with textbooks. They'll be
No.
supplementing with reading books. Books.
Well, and in those high quality instructional materials, it addresses writing, it addresses text complexity,
Okay.
it addresses what we have talked about in terms of this, the science of reading, which is more than just the foundational literacy aspect. It is students being exposed to rich content. It is students being exposed to writing. It is students being exposed to language development. All of the things that our ELA standards address are embedded into those high quality instructional materials that the board has already gratefully approved for our school divisions.
Then I would just say the last thing I would say that I don't need to hear now, but hopefully we can hear in March, and maybe you all can put out there sooner if you've got it. But when are the instructional guides going to be available? And then the assessment piece. When are the teachers going to know what they're going to be tested, what their kids are going to be tested on? And when are we going to be doing our piece to, you know, determine test cutoffs and all of that? And again, I'm happy to hear that in March rather than today, unless you want to do it.
I do think a lot of that is very significantly determined by when we adopt these standards, number
Right.
one. Number two, I think I'd like to step back a little bit. I know that, you know, we all talk about high quality instructional materials. What that really means is exactly what we've been doing with history, with math. We're being extremely consistent in how we move through the processes as we go through these standards revisions, and how then we address things like the former curriculum guides, the former documents that we all knew in the classroom that we depended on. Those documents are becoming more fully fleshed out as resource type opportunities for teachers as far as how they may wish to address certain parts of the standards instructionally. But they are almost exactly what the word means, resources and guides, not something to use as a crutch, because I do think that we were using a lot of our materials in past years that we had provided. The frameworks were a crutch. It wasn't leaned dependent upon what the standards were actually saying. And so recognizing that, moving towards more of a resource guide opportunity is going to give more oomph, credence to the standards themselves. And I think that's kind of the direction we've been going with history, the direction we went with math, and I see it here very consistently as we're moving into these ELA standards. Ms. Ashton?
Yep. President Casey, thank you. VLA team, wonderful job. I love reading them. I think it's important because when we say new standards, it makes it feel like it's like brand new. I wish we were saying clearer standards, because when you see it from one to the other, it's just further broken down. I think this is empowering to teachers and to leaders versus being like very big picture. So I just applaud the team and say, yeah, what we're doing is setting the bar really high for each grade and giving clarity to teachers on exactly what they should be focused on. I think the challenge is priorities. And one of the things you said earlier that I'm excited to hear back is, now once you set the standards high, we know that kids are going to have gaps. And so the tools around remediation and acceleration, I think that is where the greatest opportunity is. And I know, so I'm wondering how we, as we're continuing to roll, I hate roll out because it feels like steamroll, as we continue to share and get feedback, how we then pretty quickly pivot to, now that the standards are high, how do we close the gaps? To me, that's going to be the part that's most empowering to teachers and to leaders, along with, and I agree, we can't get to assessments until we adopt the standards. And given our accountability conversation, it's like, how do all of those come together? Standards, assessments, accountability framework, because what we don't want is high standards, high stake testing, no acceleration and support, And now the great work we've done on standards, which is just clear. I mean, that's why it's not new. It's just clearer, gets undermined. So I think just the messaging around, quite honestly, what we're doing is just as important as the literal standard. So I just want to say thank you and keep up the good job.
Thank you.
Mhm.
And I just want to point out that in the middle of all that, to the board's point, is instruction,
Yeah.
right? And high quality instruction and making sure that our teachers have what they need, right? Which is the high quality instructional materials, right? We give them really great standards.
Mhm.
And then we give them great instructional materials so that they can do what they need to do in the classroom. We empower them with great materials, right? And then their cycle that you're talking about in terms of assessment just flows within that cycle.
Yeah.
And then it ensures that every student, whatever classroom they're in, I think to the president's point, gets quality materials,
Mhm.
quality text, ensures that every classroom within a school building is exposed to quality materials at grade level appropriate, right? Reach, so the scaffolds and supports then are there. And then that's where the focus is, because we're not spending our time necessarily on finding the materials, but rather on the instruction.
Yep, that's great.
Anyone else? Dr. Siebert?
Again, great standards, great work. Really appreciate what you're doing. And so my question, it might actually be more of just a thought, a mindfulness as we move forward, especially as we start talking about our work plan going ahead. I think there are some just kind of harsh realities and the way our standards work is kind of crunched up. And so there's kind of like going down the interstate, there's something slows things down, traffic gets together, but take a while to get things spread out again. And that's creating some harsh realities. So I love the timelines you all put together and the graphics with the timelines and showing where we are, what's happening, when, and where we're going. I also look forward to what's going to be the next pieces of that, because eventually we have to think about those other parts. I think as a board, and again, I think the department and the staff do a great job out in the field, supporting the fact that schools and divisions are all as different as the different children that they contain.
Mhm.
And so some of the harsh realities here are, and we'll come back to our work plan piece, is that there is a bunch coming through it really close on the heels of one another, and capacity to handle that varies widely. It varies in the size of the division. There are very large school divisions that have terrific people who get to fall asleep thinking about English language arts and wake up thinking about English language arts. But there are also very small divisions where those people are thinking about English language arts and history and government and oh my gosh, the federal programs and doing our Title I audit. I mean, these people, there's just so much there. So the large divisions with dedicated people are at an advantage. So that means we have to support the folks that don't have those resources. There's also the piece of, I think it was touched upon. Again, having taught high school, but been an elementary school principal, there is a difference. Even in a small division, small high school, you might have a department chair who is helping filter work and lead and guide those 6, 8, 12 English teachers through what's happening. But at the elementary level, where most of our teachers are teaching all the core content areas, they're doing it without department chairs. And if they're doing it in a division without a dedicated team, falling asleep and waking up thinking about that content, this, no matter how we frame it or message it, is a lot. Not just, I'm not talking about English, but just the where we are, the harsh reality where we are now. And so I think that kind of support and effort in our work plan moving forward, especially about the implementation. Again, the idea of having much better standards and waiting 2 years to implement them, that doesn't make sense. But the idea of putting everything into the pipeline at one time, my heart is very much concerned about our English, our elementary educators. And I know that we have great people going to work that, but just like we differentiate instruction for students, we have to differentiate our support for the divisions that we serve.
Dr. Coons?
I think you guys have heard things that we are really working to focus on. And one of the things that Marcy and Katie are working on is regional support networks and making sure we have regional people in the field, in particular in our regions like Region 7, Region 6, some of our smaller regions that don't necessarily have those robust offices to have field staff that go out and support those. So we're working to put that in place, but obviously we got to get the standards adopted first. But those are things that I'm really encouraged that the team are thinking about and putting together and in place to roll in support, both in the reading and the math space. Because we've heard from the regions that they need someone boots on the ground to go side by side with them. I will say one of the most exciting things I have heard on boots on the ground is that our instructional supervisors have started to come together again. And this fall, may be happening in some places in the state, as you mentioned, as different as the children we serve. But our regions are really starting to come together and building close practice across the instructional supervisors. So you might have been a math teacher and I might have been an ELA teachers, but when we come together once a month, we're really talking about implementation together and building each other's capacity. So it's really exciting, and hats off to these guys who are really working collaboratively to build those networks and those supports to think differently about the field, in particular in elementary. I sat with elementary principals on Sunday and asked them specifically, what do you want to see from us? How do you want us to roll this out to your teachers? How do you want us to think about this? And what is most important to you? Because it's important for us. I would say our principals know this better than anyone else. What are the capacities of the teachers in their building? And so it's important for us to be close with them, and they gave us some really good feedback, but we're going to continue to work with our principals council every month to get their feedback, and also our teacher advisory group to really help us think about what makes sense. But if you're hearing things, or if there's places we need to sit down, I know we're sitting down with VASCD in the next 2 weeks to really start talking about what this looks like in a regional support kind of way. So we're excited to be thinking about not just being in Richmond and not just visiting, but how do we deploy teams that really help in different regions? Because I think that's a very important space that we need to move into, and excited that the team will be able to talk a little bit more about that in March.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Madam President.
Please, Dr. Siebert.
And just by extension, I always want to start with the students first and the staff who serve them. But there's also going to be mindfulness here in terms of the school boards and the local governing bodies and the appropriating bodies. You know, our friends who have experience on school boards know that often, especially in a smaller division, you're probably going to break your English language adoption up, and you are going to focus on primary and upper. And so yes, the anthology pieces, there's things that can be worked and transferred, but these massive core content adoptions generally carry along big price tags. And I'm not talking about just the books, but the other resources and services that go along with that. So again, that's the other thing we have to be mindful of is the capacity to be, bringing on new materials for history as well as for mathematics, as well as for language arts. And so I think the idea of what you have that you can continue to use is very important. But I think we can expect there to be a pinch in a lot of localities that we're just going to be sensitive to.
Thank you.
Anything else?
I'll just note that we can maybe
Ms.
bring this,
Holton?
have this conversation more when we get to work plan, but I do see in the slide number 2, Dr. Sorensen introduced the overall standards chart, the suggestion that we might be accelerating the science standards. And we did hear some feedback from the field on that. And so far, what the board's action on that has been was our February 23 of this year, we approved a timeline for science that was consistent with the normal 7-year process that would be at least 1.5 years behind this list. So that's a conversation I hope we have at some point, but we don't want to assume. I see that the department aspires to accelerating that timeline, and I look forward to a future discussion on how realistic that is in light of everything else.
Yeah, and based on our feedback that we all received last week, I am meeting with the VASCD and their science team to
Great.
talk through their concerns. So we can definitely hear that.
Anything else on this item? Thank you, ladies. We
Thank you so
appreciate
much.
all your hard work.
I appreciate your feedback.
Great work.
See you on the road.
Okay, we're gonna take about a 5-minute break so that our next presenters can get themselves set up and ready, and we're taking a quick 5-minute break. Thanks.
Yeah.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we are moving on to our accountability redesign discussion. And I believe we have Chad at the helm of this one.
That's cool. Partner in crime. That's cool.
Go ahead.
Take it away.
All right, it's great to see you all. This is hopefully going to be an interactive section. I would love to hear feedback. We're trying to gather feedback. Are some things that we're going to present to you of what we've heard from stakeholder convenings that we had around the state. We have some recommendations or considerations for you all from things that we heard. We also have some things that we're putting in front of you for the first time, and we want to hear your feedback on options on how to combine different elements into an accountability system. So I'll start with the overview and timeline of where we've been, where we're going. As you all know, but just to remind you, in October, you all voted to move forward with the accountability work. And we are proceeding. In November and December, we had a round of stakeholder feedback that we went to the 8 regions across the state and presented on some of the information that we had already talked to you all about, primarily on indicators and how they folded into an accountability system. What we're hoping for today is feedback on the high-level framework on how to combine indicators into a system, and then also starting to think about how to identify schools that need more supports, as well as how to fold in student groups and other considerations. Looking ahead, we're planning to bring back a draft for you all to look at of potential early workings of an accountability system in March, the March meeting. And then we would take that out for a second round of stakeholder feedback where we could go back and hear from stakeholders on a more robust, fully developed accountability system. From there, the board would review and approve the new accountability system potentially in June. And then there'd be a first year of data collection and the full implementation of the accountability system first results would likely come out in the fall of 2025. That's if we can meet all those deadlines. I will say if anything is pushed back from that, then we're risking pushing another year on the timeline there, but that's what we're aiming for. It's what we're working towards at the moment. All right, so the agenda for what we're going to do is we're going to report out on the stakeholder conversations on what we did and what we heard and what we suggest based on stakeholder feedback. There are going to be some options for you all to weigh in on. And then at the end is more new things that we have not talked about is from the accountability indicators, how do we build it up into a system? And then a brief, hopefully, discussion on what comes next. So we had stakeholder feedback meetings in the 8 regions. Dr. Coons went to all of them, and I went to some. My colleague Ann Heislop also went to some. Katie went to some as well. And Katie went to all of them. We invited board members, local elected officials, and district leaders. We reached out to the public via the superintendent's memo, and we amplified through social media, radio, and print media. We had about 375 attendees. I believe you all have a copy of the full notes if you want to see those. The Hunt Institute coordinated them, and they were designated note takers for those meetings as well. A broad range of people were in attendance, from teachers and parents to school board members, division superintendents, and directors of testing. We presented on things that you all have seen before. On slide 4 is something that we talked about at the fall meeting, is the combination of different indicators. So we talked to them about their feedback on achievement and growth and readiness, as well as anything else on their minds. We always had an open call for any other questions or comments. Okay, so what I'm gonna do now is talk through some of the feedback that we heard. I'm gonna go section by section. So I'm gonna do what we heard on the feedback and then also some recommendations for how we're potentially gonna use those and build into a new accountability system. We heard widespread acceptance that achievement matters. So there's general support that achievement is very important. We talked through the achievement index that we talked through last time, and there's broad support for that type of a way to measure achievement rather than just a pure proficiency, but of having a achievement index or a mastery index. But cautions that we want to keep it as simple as possible. So not to get too complicated, not to make it too sophisticated. There's also broad support for the inclusion of growth. So we talked about the VIVAS system for measuring growth, and there was general agreement that the growth is important. We're going to talk a little bit about weighting, but in general, I think people said equal weighting potentially, particularly in K-8. There were some questions around the mechanics of VIVAS and how it specifically worked and the formulas, et cetera. The one thing I'll flag for this group is there was some confusion and concerns around high schools. So because VIVAS looks from one year to the next, and high school has two potential challenges. One is may not be a test in year one and a test in year two. So there may be a time lag, and that can create some problems for measuring growth. The other thing is on math, as students go to different types of tests, that can also add some complications for measuring growth at the high school level. Okay, so the other thing I'll say is that if you want to see all the comments, I would look at the Hunt Institute notes. What I'm going to focus on is the relevant comments pertaining to accountability.
They don't have the Hunt Institute notes yet. We are missing 2 sessions, so we are trying to get those cleaned up and get them out as soon as possible. So
Okay,
we are
great.
working to get those to you in the next day or two. We just were missing 2 sessions.
Yeah, the one thing you'll see in there's a lot of comments about lots of different types of things. And what I'm framing my comments today is trying to consolidate some of the comments that are relevant to the accountability discussion. There's lots of other things that we could spend time on, or you can read the notes for more. So how to proceed in achievement and growth at the K-8 level. We recommend or would consider using the achievement through a simple mastery index. We talked about this last time, and I've done some weighting on those. In general, the mastery index are very tightly correlated with proficiency rates, peer proficiency rates, but they're slightly different and they work in a different way. One is that they give acknowledgement or credit for students at different levels of performance. And so they also give more incentive for schools to care about students going from below basic to basic or from proficient to advanced. What else? The other things to note is that high schools have a slightly different mechanism for the number of performance levels than what K-8 uses. So we recommend a similar one, but it won't be the exact same. From now, based on what I mentioned on the high school growth challenges, we would recommend potentially not including them in growth measure in high school. It is more complicated, and happy to talk through some of those, but at least for the moment, we would say maybe it's not the best time to incorporate it. We put a sample mastery index on slide 8 if you want to see what those could look like. They're very similar to the ones that we put in front of you in the fall. They essentially give more credit to students who are going up the ladder, a biggest jump to students who make the jump into proficient, but there's still some credit for advanced as well. We also looked and saw whether there's some schools that are strong outliers, and I would say there's not that many of schools that have advanced kids that are compensating for students below basic. And so I would say that's not really too much of a concern with Virginia's distribution of students. Any questions on achievement and growth before we move on to the next step? Any questions, comments, feedback?
I'm sorry, Chad. So knowing that you work with a number of, or have worked with a number of different states around this kind of work, I mean, is equally distributing the weight between growth and achievement something that's typical?
Yeah, I can respond. I think it is fairly typical. There is quite a bit of distribution on either side. I would say achievement tends to be probably a little more weight than growth. There are fewer states that give growth far more weight than achievement, but it's close to, if not around 50-50. Yeah. Dr. Stieber, did you want to jump in?
No. I was my too many fingers on my trackpad. My slides went away. I was
Okay.
Dr. Gates, did you want to say something here? No, okay, sorry.
Yeah, the one thing I'll also say is, we're not asking for a vote per se today. What we'd like is your direction and guidance. So we're going to get into a weighting conversation in a little bit. The next big topic area is the K-8 readiness measure. And I'm going to start with a discussion around chronic absenteeism. Similarly to achievement, there's widespread agreement that attendance matters. It's important for kids to go to school. And so I think people around the state understand that. But they also had some concerns that schools may not have full control over it. So there are things that schools can do to boost the rates, but there's still some things that are more innate to students and families that schools can't control everything. So I think one recommendation or one consideration coming from that conversation would be maybe include it, but don't have it as such a high weight. Given the current system, it has a very high weight, given that any one measure can drive a school's rating overall. The way that this will be incorporated as a balanced index means that chronic absenteeism, consistent attendance would not drive any one school's rating. The other thing I'll say about the K-8 readiness is there's a lot of interest in something else beyond consistent attendance. So some other measure, whether that's the 5C survey or other survey of SEL type inputs of student performance or student behaviors. The one thing that I'll comment on that is that we didn't have anything else to recommend for you all. If there's something that you all think is that you would like to see in that, we would love to hear that and love to hear that feedback. There wasn't broad consensus on any existing element that already could be applied. The challenge is it would have to be something that is administered statewide and meaningfully differentiates across schools. So there aren't that many things that actually meet those criteria that accomplish those things.
Yes. Before Ms. Holton speaks, I just want to say, if you all have questions, please feel free to, or comments, please jump in here at any time.
Yes, please.
Ms. Holton?
I know we'll get to discussion later, but just on that specific point, I remember when we went through this, the last revision, one of our goals was to have our state accreditation methodology align as much with our federal accountability requirements, our federal plan, that's a plan, as we could. And the feds require us to have something beyond the academic measures. And we looked at things like school climate surveys and things that might or might not meet this readiness concept, but that would be something else in the non-academic category. And it was just too hard with the data we had available then to find anything that met the federal requirements of differentiating schools and being available across different demographic groups, et cetera. We just didn't have the capacity. And I know some other states have done climate measures instead of chronic absenteeism, but we essentially did chronic absenteeism as that measure because it was the easiest thing. And I don't mean to say that it's not important, because I think it is. And I think having an absenteeism measure, I am in support of it, but to find something else, if we tried to do something else in addition to or instead of, I would hope it would be something that would meet the federal requirements as well, so that we don't have a state-based accountability system that's too different from our federal accountability. And Ted, you may be able to tell us, what are other states using in that spot? Are there any other things other states are using that we might want to look at? Or is everybody else falling back to chronic absenteeism because that's what the data makes easiest?
Dr. Coons?
Yeah, first I want to give a shout out to Katie Carroll, because she has worked on the national level on federal accountability, and it will help us make sure that we don't do exactly what you said, and has helped us in the conversations. I will say across the state, I know we've kind of went very quickly through a lot of slides, and want to back up just a little bit. We heard a lot of conversation, in particular from elementary principals, about could we use a performance task that's embedded and do something like that around readiness? Could we do things, as you mentioned, we had a lot of climate survey kind of conversations and talked about the difficulty in data, but a lot of opportunities and a lot of things came out of conversations about could we use the data a little bit differently? So if we give an SOL test, could these 5 questions show readiness versus this? And I think that's pendant on, do we get to update the assessment system and get some really innovative pieces in the assessment system that allow us to have some flexible measures in the inside the assessment system that allow us to do readiness. So I think there's some opportunity there, but it hinges on whether or not we can update the assessment system to do some of the creative things that other states are doing in assessment items. So if we look across the country at some of the assessment items are extremely innovative and allow us to capture thinking and writing and all of those things that you would think would be elementary ready and be standardized, as you're saying. But our current assessment system has worked very hard to keep up, but we need some investment in those dollars, as mentioned by the 5.8. And I'm pointing to this group because a lot of people on this board were on the 585 work group, but that was one thing that came clearly out of there is if we are able to update our assessment system, then there are things we could use in addition in the readiness measure. And we heard that in a couple of different places, in particular with some elementary principals about some things they would like to see, thinking about demonstrating their readiness as students move on to middle school. But we also, as you mentioned, heard a variety of things about readiness that we can't measure. So I appreciate you calling that out.
Ms. Holton?
And if that's helpful for me to understand, Dr. Coons, and you say if we're able to update our assessment system, and some of that depends on the budget request that's now pending in the General Assembly for the assessment system. And assuming that that goes well, we're still talking about the assessment system, the new assessment system, if we're able to have one, it's a year or more away before we'll know what we might be able to do in accountability based. In other words, a little bit, we're a cart before the horse to be doing accountability reform before we've got our assessment reform done. That worries me.
Dr. Coons?
I actually think we're lined up well because the General Assembly, as long as we have a budget after March, we have the assessment RFP, which will include those expectations in there. And there are items across the country that are there that we can pull from and move pretty quickly, but it will depend on when we come back in March, we'll have better information for you.
So for instance, you might be able to come back in March to tell us what a readiness indicator might look like that we could include now, even though we might not have the RFP done until later, we could know what we're going to ask for in the RFP.
We definitely have the potential to do that. And the RFP is in final form to be able to do that dependent on budget asks. Yes. Thank you for clarifying.
Dr. Northern?
So I'll bring up a couple things that just may muddy the waters a little bit. And I think I brought it up before. So other states take the, and this is maybe what Dr. Coons is talking about, take the reading portion of their 3rd grade standardized test and count that as the early literacy portion. So they're not double counting that they're just aggregating that out, which is what Dr. Coons is saying. Okay, so that could be an early reading measure that would align perfectly with our early literacy and the fact that we're devoting so much energy to that. The other thing, and I'll just open it up, and I know some people hate this, but other states are using the percentage of children that are off track. So they're using their diagnostic district measures, and I don't know what that looks like in Virginia. I think it's just a patchwork of everything. But if we have some kind of consistency in our diagnostic reading assessment and just have like the percentage of kids in grades 1 through 3 who are deemed off track on the prior year's fall diagnostic, that's something other states are doing. Now, it makes people nervous because they say, oh, no, diagnostics aren't to be used for that. This is a summative measure. So I'm just putting it out there, but I do understand that using a diagnostic in an accountability system is sometimes a bad idea, but I'm just saying other states are doing it. But if we are really looking for something for early literacy, I think it makes total sense for us to look at the reading questions on the standardized test.
So I think that diagnostic that you're talking about was presented by Dr. Solari in the summertime. So we could probably go back into our presentations and see that just as a refresher.
Oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was going to say a couple comments to respond to a couple things. So one is, a lot of states are using chronic absenteeism. It's 36 states and DC are using it as their federal accountability system. I wanted to amplify something that Ms. Holton said, that we're striving for one federally compliant system here. So it does have to meet some parameters on the federal requirements of, has to be something that is standardized across the state and can meaningfully differentiate across schools. So that is important, that we're going to have as a reminder on several different indicators. The other thing is that we're talking about the accountability system. There are still other mechanisms to talk about performance, on whether that's the accreditation system, which isn't going away, as well as other reporting mechanisms or things too. And then Ms. Northern mentioned potentially slicing off the test in a different way. We had that in October, and that is an option if you all are interested in either slicing off a portion or potentially double counting. If you want to say third grade reading is very important, there are things that we could do if the board is interested in them.
I'm not sure that we were in a place where we wanted to double count anything. So I'm not sure that that's an on the table option
Yep.
at this point. Dr. Northern?
Sorry, and I just forgot another point. Everybody hates chronic absenteeism across the country. Let's just be honest, and we saw it in our own public feedback, because they feel like it's something that they can't control. And so I mentioned this the last time, and we've got SAS on board who are at the top of their game in the country. I'd love it if they could actually look and see if they could come up with a chronic attendance value added measure, because some states actually are going forward with that now. And it's basically the same thing as a growth measure, except you're controlling for low income and SES, just like we do on the growth measure. So it's like the same calculation, except you're in the equation, you're inserting the attendance in the equation versus the test score. Anyway, we can talk about that, but I just want to put it out there that there are improvements out there for chronic absenteeism.
Ms. Holton?
And just on that point, our current system, and this is one thing I'm very interested in making sure we focus on, and I'm sure we'll do this more in March. How does what we're proposing to do change our current system? Because we're not creating something from whole cloth. We're working from something and hopefully moving the ball forward. Our current system does give schools credit, not the individual student level, but at the school level, it gives schools credit for progress on chronic absenteeism. So if your chronic absenteeism was through the roof last year and better this year, then you don't get dinged in the same way, even if you haven't yet met, and you have a number of years, 2 or 3 years, essentially, to reach the gold standard level on chronic absenteeism. And if you don't, then you're still get dinged. You can't just keep growing to eternity and never get to the promised land. But you do have, especially relevant in a time like now when we're coming out of a pandemic, I think we will see schools this year making progress. I know they are working on it. I know they're all, I'm working with some Northern Virginia divisions as part of my George Mason job on this topic, and they're all trying very hard to meet our goals for them and their goals for themselves, because they know it matters to students' education. So I would hate to see us not include something on chronic absenteeism. I think we all know the literature shows schools can make a difference, and that if they don't make a difference, if kids aren't in class, they can't learn. It's disruptive to teachers. For all the right reasons, we should be counting chronic absenteeism in some fashion, but giving schools a way to show growth on it, improvement on it, I do think is important, as we currently do.
Mr. Sturdivant?
I agree with Ms. Holton. You should count absenteeism, but not to the point that's a detriment to the accreditation of the school. Parents are more so now choosing to do things with their children that will impact the school in a negative way. But it's the parents' choice. They choose to take their children on a trip, an educational trip. If we can reduce the weight that the attendance has on schools, I would fully support that. You know, the schools do many things. They do the perfect attendance awards. They do the quarterly attendance awards. They send people to the children's homes. I think the schools do everything they can. However, sometimes kids don't come. And because of that, teachers teach. when the kids are in the classroom. I don't think attendance should be used as a detriment. If it has to be kept at all, the value of it is reduced, so it's not negative on the school's performance.
Ms. Ashton?
Thank you. I think the shift to chronic absenteeism is the right shift, and I could just only tell from my experience. I look at attendance every single day. I want it to be 95% attendance. I'm telling my teachers, I'm saying we have a strategy, call the moms, dads, get the kids here. But what we lose in that is the chronic absenteeism, because we're just focused on the overall, like, hey, do we have 95% of kids in school today? And when this, just in the last month, we shifted to say like, no, who is chronically absent? It's a completely different strategy. It's a different conversation. We have 300 kids, and right now it's 42 of them who are chronically absent. So now we can change our strategy to those 42 versus a general, like, all school matters, every day matters, because it's not the same kids. The attendance awards, the recognition, those kids are going to come and they should be recognized. But the shift, I do think, is the right shift, because it gives schools and teachers the right focus to then change their strategy. I think why kids are not coming, there's a whole range of, whether it's a field trip or safety or a job or illness of an older family member. There are lots of reasons why kids are not coming to school, not just they're not coming to school. I really do wonder if we could be even more innovative around what counts as coming to school for a day, for example. If you don't come to school, but you log on and complete your work for that day, could that count towards attendance? Because it's ultimately about getting the work done. So I'm for having chronic absenteeism, because I do think it prioritizes limited resources to focus on the right problem. And I wonder if there's more innovative ways to count, particularly for those chronic kids. I know a couple of my kids who just don't come to school. If I send them an email and say, do all of this work, they will do all of the work that day. And should that somehow be a way to count them as present?
Mr. Sturtevant?
So would the measure be work being completed, or would it be attendance?
Attendance.
However, if they're not there and they can make up the work, does that negate their attendance? I think you said you would call those kids and say, do the work, and the parents would do the work. The kids would do the work, and that should count for something, correct?
Mm-hmm.
So it seems the greater priority is the work being done as far as the pacing versus it's important for kids to be in school, but if they can make the work up, does that lower the negativity of attendance?
Please.
So I think if you are chronically absent, which means 18 days over a year, and you miss one day in January, but then you miss 5 days in February, you are now completely disrupted in your own learning. So to me, it's more about, if you miss today, you get the work done, and you come to school the next day, you can still stay on path to the learning. But the disruption is what is throwing kids off, because when they come back, now they're further behind. You can't actually catch up. So it's not just like, oh, get the work done. It really is about a sequence. It is about the lack of disruption in your learning, because each day builds on each day. So that's why I wouldn't say, oh, well, they can just make up the work. The priority is be in person, absolutely. And there are some times when, for whatever reason, they're not. It's like, okay, if you're going to be absent this day, again, we're talking about 18 days in a 180-day school year, which I thought, okay, 18 days, is that a lot? Is it not a lot? 2 days a month. It doesn't feel like a lot. but it is a lot in terms of the learning, the learning cycle. So I think, I don't know if that answers your question, but that's how I'm thinking about it. It's not just, oh, well, I'll get the work done, because if you miss 2 months of school, you can't just make that up.
Dr. Coons? We have clear national data from the Johns Hopkins University about missing school and the impact it has on students nationally. We have clear Virginia data that on average, if a student is chronically absent, they score 18% lower in mathematics and 25% lower in reading. So we know that chronic absenteeism impacts students. We also have heard clearly from teachers across the Commonwealth, when their students here and not here and here and not here, that makes their job harder. So we know that. And we had a presentation in December, I just want to remind the board of, about school divisions. Louisa County came and described how they are using flexible time and time that is not necessarily between 7 and 3 to count towards attendance, to make sure that we're thinking about those kids who might not be here. And Louisa did a great job of sharing. They've shared nationally. It's our statewide, and it's something that we are working to make sure that we can respond to make sure we're thinking about attendance. So if I took 2.5 hours tomorrow in the evening because I was sick today, shouldn't we count that in some way towards attendance? So we are working towards thinking about attendance, but making sure attendance means you're in person with the teacher, because that is the critical mass on what makes the difference for children's performance. And that's been well documented through the research at Johns Hopkins and well documented in our own SOL testing. Dr. Siebert?
I think it might help just remember that part of the challenge we're wrestling with right here is we are looking at this issue from the way we've always done it. And we're talking about not doing it the way we've always done it. The way we've always done it is accreditation has been switches in series, not in parallel. And so to be accredited, you had to flip all 7 switches, all 8 switches, how many switches it was. And we knew that any one switch being off meant the light of accreditation went off. So then we came up with all these rules to help mitigate that and safeguard that. And so the switch is only halfway off, and it has to be off for 3 years. And, all these pieces, because again, this system was built, you were going to be accredited or not accredited, and any one switch could make you unaccredited. Well, of course, then we created accredited conditions. So I think a couple of things I just heard that I thought were really well said. Board Member Holton said, we need to do chronic absenteeism in some fashion. So I think the last conversation was about what is the fashion. I think we also heard Board Member Ashton and this latest conversation that not all absences are created equal. There's different types of absences. And right now our systems don't accommodate that. Even the report we got in December, the great work that Louisa is doing, our current systems don't make it hard to capture that. Because if I'm absent on Thursday, my record shows I was absent on Thursday. Now, the fact that I came in on Saturday and served some time to make it up, I can't go now mark the child present on Thursday because the child wasn't present on Thursday, but they now have done the work. And so, that's where the nuances are. So I think, first of all, I think the heat in the room comes way down when it's not the one switch that can make you unaccredited. So I think that this approach helps with that. But I think there are some nuances. And it might also be that out the gate, we say it's going to be chronic absenteeism at a certain weight. But I think, I've seen other states bring up, systems where they also have a little placeholder saying, stay tuned because in SY, 25, 26, we also want to look at something else. So I think that we can get at that. So I appreciate this conversation. Chronic absenteeism is absolutely essential. It's about the fashion and the fact that not all absences are created equal. Now, the other thing I just like to say, if I could, while I have the mic on slide 8, I know we kind of went to 9 and 10, talking about chronic absenteeism. I would just throw out there that on slide 8, what I like about the left-hand chart is that these levels line up with the NAEP terminology. And so I think the more that we can, if NAEP is going to continue to be a tool that's going to be used to talk about Virginia, I think the more consistent our language, the better. And so that's why I like the left-hand chart on slide 8. Thank you.
Dr. Northern?
Yeah, I just want to clarify something that's really important. So the reason that we started measuring growth across the country is because achievement is directly correlated to poverty. There's nothing stronger when you look in education research than the direct link between poverty and achievement. The same is true with absenteeism. The poorer the district, the worse kids are in terms of attendance. It has to do with a myriad of other things. So what an attendance value added growth measure does is does the same thing again that the growth measure of achievement does. You just hold constant the SES or the socioeconomic status of that child. You just hold it constant and take it out of the whole equation. So all the kids are now on the same level. Okay, it doesn't matter if you're rich, you're poor, you're middle income or whatever. You've taken that out of the equation. So if a school is working their buns off, trying to get kids to school, knocking on the doors, going here, going there, having pizza parties, whatever they're doing, they are actually getting credit for that. So you're controlling what they can't control for in an attendance growth model. You're taking the SES off the table because let's be honest, it's unfair. It's unfair. Chronic absenteeism is unfair because it's a raw measure. And so what some states are doing is saying, okay, we want the raw measure. We think the raw measure is important. We don't care if it's tied directly to poverty. Okay, we just want the raw measure. It's like the proficiency, like we say with proficiency. We don't care that it's tied to poverty. It's a correlation. We don't care. But we could say that too. We don't care that the raw chronic absenteeism rate is tied to poverty and it's unfair. We're going to keep it anyway. But we're going to add, just like we do with growth and achievement, we're going to add another growth measure on attendance that controls for the poverty correlation, takes that off the table completely, levels the playing field for all districts, and the schools that are beating the pavement to get those kids to work actually get credit. Right now, they get no credit because the correlation to poverty trumps all these other things that are going on. It washes it completely out. So I'm only making a case here because I think it's a really important, because this is a national conversation around chronic absenteeism. There are ways that we can improve upon it. We've been at this a long time now, and this is one of the ways that we can improve upon it. So I'll get off my soapbox, but I think it's an important conversation.
Dr. Myers, could you give us a little bit of info here?
Dr.
Yeah,
Myers is our
we actually
statewide expert on chronic absenteeism, so he can tell you what our statewide data
We actually
says.
just crunched this data yesterday in anticipation of some of this conversation today. No, I just texted Sass, though, the vice president, to ask how that's possible and how that'll work. So I'm waiting to hear back from him. But the we crunched and looked at city versus suburb versus town versus rural in looking at chronic absenteeism. And I'm just going to give you a couple of numbers. I think you are accurate that there are some alignments there, but I think it may be worse in suburb than you may think from what you were just saying with what our data are telling us right now. But it's stating right now that last year, so I'm looking at last year's attendance, 53% of students were of significant attendance in suburbs. So nearly half the students. Significant was not at 20, it was not at the 10% range, but just below the 10%. I'd have to look exactly where we matched that at. And 48% in city. So for significant, it was actually higher in the suburb than it was in the city. I don't know if you can compare that with socioeconomics exactly, but I'm assuming that the socioeconomics are a little higher in the suburb than potentially in the city. And then if you look though at extreme, it is 6% in the suburb and 13% in the city. So it is more, you do have more students with extreme attendance issues in the city than you do in the suburb. However, I just wanted to point out that there are still really significant attendance issues occurring in suburbs as well. So.
And again, the correlation goes both ways.
Dr.
It's just taking
Northern.
it off the table.
Ms. Holton?
So I just want to endorse Dr. Northern's suggestion that we look at and would love to have our experts come back to us in March with tell us what other states are doing to look at chronic absenteeism on a growth kind of measure, and tell us what we could do in Virginia. You know, do we have that option? Because I think that's really worth looking at. I do think that when we look at the data, we really need to look pre-pandemic and post-pandemic, but it's certainly what I've heard from divisions and some of them who've collected some of their data is some of the pandemic and immediate post-pandemic attendance issues were broader. You know, there were strong students in wealthy families taking mental health days every other day. So I wouldn't be surprised at the data Dr. Myers shared being different last year than it was 3 or 4 years ago. But the notion that poverty tracks, one of my biggest fears about this whole system we're looking at is it's just going to tell us what we already know, which is that poor schools struggle. And so anything we can do to help differentiate, not just telling us that, and when it tells us that poor schools struggle, it also, that's why, index systems increase segregation, residential racial segregation and poverty, income segregation, because these systems tell us that poor schools struggle, which we already know. I would love to have us look at a Vivas-like version of the chronic absenteeism data, see what other states are doing, see what options there are in Virginia. I think it'd be, I mean, I'm not saying whether we can do it or not, or whether it makes sense to do it, but I would love to have us explore that.
Dr. Myers.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, if they have done that, we will find out really
I
soon
can send
what
it
that
to
looks
you.
like. Yeah. I did want to point out that we were modeling after attendance works. It was a study that was done, and we wanted to measure that our data was matching what their data were saying. And so the city, rural, town, and suburb were their categories, which we have similar categories, but we could look at this at school divisions with 70% or 60% of poverty or greater versus those, or use 50%, whatever percent we want, and would give us based just on socioeconomic, not on whether it's a city or, because you could have wealthy cities, you could have wealthy, so we could look at that more directly. I just wanted to point that out, since this is being recorded, that we were modeling this off of Johns Hopkins.
I'm just clarifying, David, that they
Dr.
don't
Northern?
control for SES. Am I right about that? Or they're just breaking it out?
Correct. And
But-
we also have categories of this same thing in the state. So it was easy, which is how they got their data. And we came really close. There's a little bit of differences they had, but we were really close.
Yeah. Thank you.
Miss Ashton.
President Creasy, thank you. I think one thing I was curious if there was data on the rural, so I didn't, because you mentioned urban and suburban, so curious how rural fits into that. Is that a
Rural is better all the way around
better attendance,
than suburb or city.
And the numbers are?
roughly?
Yeah, the extreme is about the same as city, but if you look at high and significant, they're both lower. I'm more than willing to share this data.
Yeah,
Obviously,
I was
we did
just
one
curious.
yesterday, yeah. But overall, the bar charts a little lower in rural than they do in city and suburb.
Yeah, thank you. I'm surprised by that. So I had made a complete other assumption. So thanks for having that data. The other question I have though is, so I'm not familiar with the value added attendance, so I would love to hear more about that. But it did raise for me the question around weights, because, whether it's academics or attendance, it is harder to make as much progress based on SES, based on location, based on rural, urban. So I wonder where the conversation around weights happens in the overall accountability system. And my strong push is it is harder, and for schools, divisions and schools that are trying to do the work with the hardest to serve kids, there should be an incentive to do that, not a disincentive. And so making sure we are mindful of that, because if you're taking, wealthy families are taking mental health breaks, okay, that's fine. And kids who can't do that are coming to school every day trying to close those gaps, there should be an incentive for that. So I don't know how are we thinking about weights?
Yep.
Yeah.
That is the next slide. So if you go
So,
to slide 11.
Can I
that-
just I want us to move forward, but I do want to caution us, because part of the reason why we took on this project of bifurcating our accountability and accreditation system was to step back on the complexity of the current system. And so I'd like to kind of reset our thought process here because I think we're having a lot of conversations that are making us get back to a place where we could be just as complex, if not even more complex than we are currently. We are focused on transparency and ease of understanding of this system, not so that those of us who are, living in and operating in this world from a professional standpoint every day, it's not for us to understand. I certainly hope we do understand it inside and out. However, this is about how our communities, how parents, how other stakeholders are able to clearly see how our schools are educating students, how student outcomes are being communicated to the larger communities that we, sitting up here, are serving. So just step back. Let's kind of refocus a little bit here.
So let me walk you through slide 11. I will say these are very much in pencil. So we put some percentage weighting options down here for your feedback. Option 1 is a numeric. We're also putting this in the context of a regulation. So how much do we want to lock in of these are the weights we definitely want to go with versus we want to set some more textual descriptive parameters, but then leave it for other future board decisions to make more concrete. So option 1 has achievement and growth both at 40%. Consistent attendance, we have some discussion about that. We can still have that conversation, is on here at 10%, and English language proficiency, which is again is a federally required measure where that's applicable. So if there are a certain number of students that are English learners, then they would take that test to measure their English language proficiency and growth over time, and that would be calculated for those schools. If the schools did not have that, that weight would be reallocated to other things. Option 2 is
And those weights, like you put English language proficiency, not because these are from the notes or from the recommendations, just to give modeling out. I just want to clarify for the board and the public, these aren't things that we're not recommending that we use English language proficiency. You just wanted to show ways in which we could have options, correct?
That's right. Yep. These
Simple
are
examples.
very simple examples to get your feedback on what to go forward with.
Miss Holton, if you could mute your mic, I think we're getting some feedback.
We got one. Sorry.
Thank you.
So option 2 is essentially that we don't put numbers in the regulations and instead rely on descriptive language that would preserve the board flexibility going forward. If we wanted to do a study on adding value added in chronic absenteeism, that would be something you could then incorporate in an easier fashion than going through a full regulatory environment. So were there other ways to have parameters around that descriptive language on equal weight, much greater weight, other types of textual language to signal the board's intent without locking you in going forward. And then option 3 is anything else that you've heard that you want to put on the table for the conversation right now. So I'll pause there, and I'd love to hear conversation about weights. If there's other things on the indicators that you'd like to throw in as well, or reactions to these very initial numbers.
Ms. Holton?
Well, I will just say that we heard from your colleague, Ms. Haslop, back at one of the very first presentations we did on this topic. So it may have been all of last fall. I don't remember before some of you were here, but one of the things I recall her saying is if you don't weight growth heavily, then absolutely you are tracking poverty. And if you're tracking poverty, then you run the risk of increasing racial and economic segregation in your neighborhoods. And that is, as I say, a major factor for me in how we make decisions about this. So I would want to, whether or not we specify the exact numbers, I would want to say that growth is weighted at least half or at least comparable to achievement.
Please. Dr. Siebert.
So to your question, I don't know if options 1 and 2 are exclusive. I think we've already kind of talked about and heard about and just heard again the idea of using achievement and growth in parallel, so whatever weights are, so that they would be equal. And And then I think, I think really at this point, probably the 40-40-10-10 is fine as a placeholder, for moving forward. It can be the straw man that we work from going forward. But I think maybe the qualifier there of option 2 is what we're saying is that achievement and growth should be equal. Now, again, we're back to the idea of, people in the field are going to say, well, show me the tests, so we're going to come back to the assessment piece. But I think, this is probably good to move forward from, with a footnote that, yeah, these are going to be equal. We're going to go under the hood of attendance, because really your third option is what else you heard from listening sessions. It was that not all absences are created equal.
I guess I would want to throw out that yes, we know that achievement is very clearly assessment based, but I think we also, when we're talking about growth, we need to know what we are talking about. Are we comparing apples to oranges, or are we comparing apples to apples? And so that to me is a real wild card in the whole setup of how we determine whether we're weighting them equally or giving more weight to achievement. Because at the end of the day, I'm on the side that we do need to weight achievement a little bit more than we do growth. Because if we are not apples to apples in our growth measures, then where are we? Because that means that we're not measuring growth the same way in Alexandria as we are in Russell County, for example. So that's my issue. Ms. Holton?
So two things. One is, yes, we absolutely need some uniform measure of growth. And so I think what's been presented to us is a VIVAS that would be working on the backs of our SOL achievement test. I would be interested, and I do think we heard some significant feedback from the public that VIVAS is too complex, we don't understand it. And what about using a decent diagnostic growth measure? And so I would want us to hear about how we measure growth. I would hope that we think about how new assessment systems, if we're going to completely redo assessment, can our assessments give us better growth measures as well as achievement coverage? The one other thing I was going to say is I absolutely do understand that the ultimate goal is achievement, and the way we achieve that in our current system is we do not count growth at all at high school. So it's like we're growing K through 8, but high school, everybody's got to end up at the promised land. And so that is one way to weight achievement more heavily than growth, is to, and as Chad started to say, it's hard to measure. I'd be interested to know how do other states do any kind of growth measure at high school, because at high school, you're taking biology one year and chemistry the next. There's not a growth measure. And likewise, maybe English, but the subjects aren't as cumulative. So I think growth is really hard to, I don't know how people measure growth in high school. So maybe the VIVAS magic does it. But so all that to say, one way to think about weighting growth less is timing. Elementary is different from high school.
Ms. Ashton?
Oh gosh, so many things. So the one, I actually agree with you, President Creasy. Like, we want to keep the bar high. The ultimate goals, we want all kids to be masterful, proficient, and we know right now that we're not there yet. And so I am wondering, the proficiency measure, I know from where I'm working, I'm looking at the mastery index where it's basic, proficient, advanced. And where I'm working right now, they are not counting basic as towards proficient. So they will only count proficient as advanced as the highest metric, which is really hard because you want to then see the growth. But that's where the growth metric comes in, is because if you're a school that right now has all your kids below basic, but next year you get all of them to basic, that's a huge growth opportunity, but it doesn't lower the bar that ultimately we want all kids to be proficient and advanced. And so I'm wondering if we define proficiency, what's the bar for proficiency? Is it like the approaching? Is it the basic? How are we think about that? And then I have a second question, but do you have thoughts about that?
So in slide 8, the mastery index, that would be tied to the proficiency level on the state test. And then the way it gets achievement is wrapped into the accountability system overall is through the weights and the scores on the mastery index. So those weights would be essentially the achievement component of the accountability system.
So, okay, got it. So if you're more proficient, if you have more proficient, more advanced, then you're getting more points.
Yeah, exactly.
Mhm.
Sebastian, you had a second question
Yeah.
or not?
Do you want, Amber, you know this really well and have really studied the mastery index. Do you just want to kind of riff on that for a minute for the board? Because I know you did before, but I think we just need to bring it back.
For slide, which one?
Slide 8, you've talked about Ohio quite a bit in the mastery index and how that was helpful in the achievement components. I don't know if you're ready to do it. I'm
Right.
sorry for putting you on the
Yeah, I
spot,
might
but
not be ready, but,
Dr. Northern?
oh, sorry. I mean, I can pass around. I think, Ann had showed it to us one time where, you have how many kids that are scoring at each level, multiply them and then, basically, then you give them the proportion that you've attached to that in the accountability system. And then it all adds up to a quote score, on a 0 to 100. I'm not saying that we're going to go that route. But a lot of states will make it a 0 to 100 scale. And based on how many kids you have performing at each of these, this is just the proficient piece, right? And then we've got to add all these other pieces together. So this weighting is, is only coming into play for some of those indicators on the placemat.
But it actually
Dr.
doesn't
Pence.
say proficient. It's not binary anymore.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Right.
It's not binary anymore. So a lot of you talked about achievement being just a measure of these things. This measures everyone who tested, and
That's right.
everyone who tested counts in some way,
That's
shape, or
right.
form.
You're giving everybody credit along the continuum of performance. And just real quickly, I think where I'm landing is just descriptors. I feel like, we really want to do this right. I know all of us are really earnest about this. This is a huge endeavor we're trying to do to move our system forward. And so I would be interested in looking into the diagnostic measures that other states are using, what we're using, how we feel about that or not. For the progress of off-track readers with our early literacy piece, I'd be interested in more discussion around just blocking off the reading items on our SOL test to see if that's viable for our early literacy measure. And on the chronic absenteeism side, I'd be interested in looking at a growth measure and also looking at partial absenteeism. That's another thing that states are doing. They're able to track kids who are there for part of the day, because sometimes when you take attendance after second bell and the kid comes in at third bell, oh, well, too bad. You've already been marked absent. And it's a real game changer for the states who can measure partial absenteeism because they end up getting a lot more credit than the states that are not and districts are not able to measure partial absenteeism.
Chad,
Yes.
keep us going.
All right, let's keep going. The next thing is high school. So we've already talked a little bit about this. I'm going to start on the readiness indicators, slide 12. The field, what we heard is broad support for a variety of different readiness measures reflecting multiple pathways to college, careers, and military. Some interest in a civics measure as well, which we talked about at our last meeting. I would say there's a general support, although not universal, on treating the measures as a cohort measure. And what I mean by that is, did students, by the time they graduate, complete some readiness metrics that show that they are ready to succeed in the next phase of life, rather than trying to say, what are the readiness measures of each individual kid at the high school? So it's more a cohort based of the graduating class of 2024. We want them to all have some pathway going forward.
May I just clarify?
Ms. Holton?
The cohort method is what our current
That's
career
right.
readiness indicator is,
That's right. That is correct. Yep. So essentially keeping that as a way of signaling to the field that we want all kids to be ready for the life that precedes high school. There was also concern about turning it into a new combined rate. We heard this called out of, we don't want it to be too obscure and throwing in lots of things that aren't necessarily correlated to each other. And we want to be able to tell the difference between the pathways and whether they're all equally rigorous or not. I'm not going to spend any more time on chronic absenteeism, except we heard this in the high school space as well. So what we would put on the table in slide 13 is sort of a readiness measure that's very similar to the current one. The differences that I would call out would be the definition here is more based on actual attainment of different things, as opposed to the current one has things like work-based learning or participated in junior ROTC pathway or CTE pathway. These are demonstration of the percentage of kids who reach different thresholds, like earning post-secondary opportunities, earning an industry credential in a high demand, earning at least a 31 on the ASVAB. You could also add bonuses for students who demonstrate different diploma seals. So Virginia has a range of different diploma seals, including a civics and a STEM, that the accountability system could give credit for schools who help more students earn those diploma seals.
Ms. Holton?
So what you would be subtracting here from what we currently, you'd be clarifying some things around the military, for instance. And ideally, we would be tightening up our list of high demand occupations on the industry credential. But what this would lose from our current system is any credit for work-based learning, internships, et cetera.
Some of them are incorporated into the various diploma seals. So depending on how those were incorporated, we could still include them that way, but not for all kids necessarily.
So that would worry me. I think that, I mean, I know they're a little fuzzier and harder to measure as concretely as, say, a passing test on an industry credential test. But I do think that one of the big innovations we've made over recent years is encouraging schools to do more work-based learning, more experiential learning to support, schools like the Hampton divisions that have got folks out working in the community and connecting with industry and getting exposed to career options, even if it doesn't necessarily mean a credential in a high demand occupation. I just think that's a real advance that we've made, and it would be very unfortunate to give it up.
I do think that was included in what Dr. Armstrong had presented to us earlier when we talked very specifically about this particular piece of our high school. This was, gosh, I don't know,
Right.
August?
Right, not that, so that's why I'm questioning, it seems to be dropping out here.
Okay, so maybe Chad, we want to just go back and
Sure, if that's, yeah.
make sure.
Yeah, I think, Ann, you're making a very good point. I think what Andy said over the summer is that as part of that credentialing, what he and Dave have worked on is incorporating work-based learning into that credentialing process. So it's part of that package process. Instead of it being a one-off certificate for like Microsoft Office, it's about the industry, it's the stackable pathway and the completion of that pathway, which includes that work-based learning experience. Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
And I know we have worked, your staff has worked over the years on defining work-based learning so that it doesn't just mean I went to a career fair one time. It does have to mean something, but figuring out how we define it, how we measure it, how we make it real, I'm all for. But dropping it, I'm not for.
Miss Ashton?
This is remind me about credit requirements for high school graduation, and we have them, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so wondering about like a 9th grade credit on track or readiness, because the one thing I think you said earlier, and I would love to hear more, is that it is hard to measure growth at high school because biology, chemistry, algebra, geometry. But I think the data says that at the end of 9th grade, if a scholar is not on track for credits, they're at greatest risk for dropping out. And so I'm wondering if we thought about a 9th grade on track metric as part of the accountability.
Dr. Siebert?
was ninth grade assistant principal for a long time, holding a special place in my heart. And so I think that, yes, it's a huge metric. Back to the idea of keeping our system kind of simple. I'm hedging on that. I think maybe it would help to zoom out for a moment and just, first of all, I'm thankful to Chad and that this group and our board has been thinking about high school differently than elementary and middle school. I think eventually we're going to think about middle school a little differently, where eighth grade looks a little bit more like high school and sixth grade looks a little more like elementary. But I think those are nuances we can come back to. I'm looking at slide 14 and the idea of emphasizing four-year graduation rates, but also giving credit to extended year rates. I think to some extent it addresses the freshman thing, because again, if we're focusing on four-year graduation, that's great. We also need to celebrate the kid who graduates in 5 and the school that kept him in and it kept him or her in, those kinds of things. But I think just from this whole macro level piece, we just need to keep bearing in mind that elementary is about foundation. And even elementary's foundation is divided between primary and upper elementary in the way it works, but elementary about foundation. Our middle schools are still largely about exploration. And again, that exploration is different for the eighth grader who is still struggling in math versus the eighth grader who is knocking out geometry. And so I think that we got to realize that those kids are different places and the schools are doing great work there. But I'm okay with the high school being different in this approach because high school is about preparation. We go from foundation to exploration to preparation. If the high school is about preparation, we want to be careful not to box ourselves into what that preparation is because young people are going on different paths. So I like this part. I think the idea of using the diploma seals really haven't had a lot of meaning. I think there's some really cool stuff there. The last thing I'll say is, well, I think you just touched on, Ms. Ashton, is linked to this, just like linked to all this is our assessment work. Linked to this is our high school redesign work. It's one of the things I didn't bring up earlier, but I was excited to hear about in English, and the idea of losing content in our English at the high school level is because we do have credits that you have to earn, but as long as we keep those credit numbers large, then we squeeze out opportunities for CTE and early college and workplace and a whole bunch of other stuff. So I'm glad that we're looking at high school differently. I think we need to continue to, and I think there's really cool stuff we'll be able to do there and link to this.
Ms. Ashton?
Yeah, I agree. I personally hate the credit requirements because it does lock you in to say like a kid is not interested in this and they want to do this, but because you have this, so but I am wondering about how but it's just like it's an early warning. If you're not on track for something at ninth grade, then how do you wait till the 4th or the 5th or the 6th year to be able to take action? But I agree. I want us to remain innovative, but I also want us to have the indicators that maybe there's some lessons learned or there's an opportunity for intervention. But high school's tough.
Dr. Siebert?
And I think it's exciting there is that you could actually look at eighth grade middle school readiness, including how many of your eighth graders are accumulating credits or demonstrating those things. So there's really, I think there's cool work we can do.
I think if I could just jump in real quickly, I absolutely love the diploma seal idea, only because I'm a big liberal arts proponent. I was not one who knew what I wanted to do the day I set foot in college, much less high school. So, I think we've really got to give kids the opportunity to have as many experiences as they can have to give them just the openness of the world and what the opportunities are out there for them. So, yes, I'm just not someone who's wanting to push kids down a particular road just because they show a little bit of interest in something, give them broad experiences. So as much as we can support that, while at the same time supporting those kids who are highly focused on one particular route or another. Dr. Northern?
Yeah, just real quickly, and I've mentioned this before, I'm just getting increasingly concerned, not just here, but across the country. Dual credit is getting to be like just passing it out like candy, to be honest. And, you know, the original intent is that the kids are actually getting a real higher education experience with a higher ed faculty. And it's turned into, you know, something that's not that. And so I just would continue to encourage our folks who are working on CTE and so forth, to just make sure that we're holding the line on dual enrollment and dual credit.
Yep, I appreciate all those. I've been taking notes. Dr. Siebert already teased up a little bit on the graduation components, so want to transition us to that. It's on slides 14 and 15 if you want to follow along. The one thing that we heard from the field is to emphasize the 4-year graduation rates, but also consider giving extra credit to extended year rates, whether that's 5-year or 6-year. There were mixed opinions on pathways beyond the standard and advanced diplomas. So we heard quite a few concerns that too many students were being pushed into alternative diploma types, applied studies, and certificates of completion. So we're going to get into that as well. A couple options about proceeding, and one I just want to make sure that we're all aware of is that if we go to the federal system, federally compliant system, we do have to include the 4-year adjusted cohort rate. Virginia currently uses that as their federal school accountability system. They use the federal 4-year rate. That would mean necessarily discontinuing the GCI, the Graduation Completion Index, which includes all diploma types, including GEDs and certificates of completion. That's about 3.8% of students across the state that are graduating with some of those diplomas. That doesn't mean all those students would not capture or not qualify for the federal 4-year cohort adjusted rate. It does mean that some of them would not. And so that is an issue that I think stakeholders would be concerned about. So I'm curious, I'd love your feedback on how to think about these issues, how to think about potential weighting of them, if you have a particular preference on extended year rates or any other options or thoughts on these.
Ms. Holton?
And just to be clear, I think what we're doing currently is we do a state graduation rate and a federal graduation
That's right.
rate. So we report both. And we use the federally mandated definition for our calculations of the federally mandated school interventions. And then we use the state definition of graduation for our state accountability. And it is unfortunate that they're not in line. It's not overwhelmingly, it basically means our state graduation rate looks a few percentage points higher overall and on a school by school basis than our federal graduation rate. And we will have to keep reporting the federal graduation rate if we either need to adopt the federal graduation rate or we continue to have a bifurcated. Those are kind of the options, I think.
Yeah, you could say we're going to use the federally compliant system in our school identification system, but then continue to report the state system. So basically flip the way that they're working right now. But yes, if you want to put it in the system, it should be the 4-year or the extended year cohort rate.
Anyone
Yeah,
else?
we don't currently have an
Holton?
extended one.
That's right.
We do have an
That's right.
expanded one where we include GEDs, et cetera. But I don't think we count the 5- and 6-year now. So we have expanded but not extended graduation is the difference between the current Virginia rate and the federal definition.
I can add a little color
Maybe.
on this
Did I
as
get that
well
right?
as context for you all. I haven't seen it for Virginia. I don't know if it's collected here, but nationally, the going from 4-year to 5-year adds about 1% to a school's graduation rate, which is not a lot from a state level. If you go from 5 to 6-year, it adds like 0.3%. So it's not a big difference. The differences are some schools might be particularly affected by those changes.
Ms. Holton?
That might be what you just, it might be interesting, if we're gonna keep 2 lists, one question would be, are they differentiating different schools? So it would be interesting in your modeling for us to run, does the federal graduation rate really identify different schools for intervention purposes than the current state definition or a state extended adding 5 and 6 years? And if not, you know, we can report different rates just for states, for localities and high schools' own sense of their progress. But if it's identifying the same schools for intervention, no matter which definition you use, then I'll be for, let's go with the federal rate because it's simpler and it's not gonna make any real difference. So, you know, our schools that are graduating more with GEDs or more 5 and 6 years, is it somehow differentiating schools differently?
Yep.
That would be worth knowing.
We should be able to run those. Yeah. That's good. All right. Well, I would transition us then to slide 16, which is options for weighting. We have two, as Dr. Kruger mentioned, these are very early preliminary numbers to get your feedback and reactions. They aren't that different in terms of the percentages. Those are two options in numeric terms, or if you like the sort of descriptive language, that's also on the table as well. If we're doing it in K-8, I think it makes a lot of sense to continue doing it in high school, but I'm open to, or we would love your feedback and any thoughts on your reactions to what's on the table here.
So sorry, I'm going back a slide, Jad, or two, but I see where the public was talking about an interest in a civics measure, but don't know what. And so I wondered just if we could entertain for this bonus. I'm trying to think, like, where could that go? And we have this bonus for students who demonstrate readiness in multiple ways. And I wonder if one opportunity for demonstrating readiness in civics, given that we've really killed ourselves on high quality civic standards, is, you know, maybe you give seniors if they register to vote and if they pass the naturalization test, they can get a diploma seal in citizenship or something like that. I mean, because I know that we all are passionate about civics, and I'm just trying to figure out, we don't want to mandate that all the kids take the naturalization test, but just trying to kind of work that in terms of, and I know a lot of districts actually require seniors to register to vote before they graduate. So anyway, I just thought that might be something we could talk about in the civics area. Can kind of skip that.
I like that idea. Chad, is that on your list?
I was actually looking at the seal in civics education. It doesn't have voting or the federal citizenship test. It does talk about Virginia and United States history, earning a grade of B or higher. It's about attendance and no disciplinary infractions. It's completing 50 hours of voluntary participation in community service or extracurricular activities, et cetera.
And we could have the community service piece alongside the other pieces that Dr. Northern was describing, but I mean, this is our decision, right? So that might be.
But am I right that the civics diploma, a seal is one we award too? So we might want to rework that as an option.
Right.
And to include some of those things, I'd also love to see participation in debate team or competitions of, you know, that kind of nature, we the people, et cetera. There's a lot going on out there that it would be great to encourage and recognize and reward. I think that's a great way to think about it, is fitting into the readiness indicator. That way we're not ignoring it, but we're not over complicating.
Madam President.
Dr. Siebert?
So to your question about the weights and things, I'm kind of thinking where I was in the great conversation the colleagues on the board had during the elementary, middle school piece is maybe we do this graphically, not numerically, sort of like we did previously back to the placemat idea that we say for, you know, for elementary, middle school, we're talking about a big block is achievement, a big block is growth, and then two little bars underneath for chronic absenteeism and for English language proficiency. And then here at the high school level, again, we're kind of changing it to its achievement and graduation, and then a bar that's kind of readiness. And this way, because I don't know if we're ready to lock in on numbers as we've talked about, but I think we definitely are on what are the big pieces in the mosaic versus what are the little pieces in the mosaic.
The other thing I'll say on that approach is that gives us more time. So we can have a regulation that is potentially more descriptive in nature, but then for the ESSA state plan that we have to show to the feds and for an accountability manual that we get ready for schools and districts, those are where the board can lock in and make those decisions and have more time to run more data, et cetera, as well.
Dr. Coons?
And Amber, I think you said that earlier. You voted more for the descriptive measure. So I think what we're hearing as our next step to come back in March is have some kind of descriptive components with some options on the items that we've taken notes on. Is that what we're hearing, both on the elementary, middle, and the high school? So having some kind of descriptive spaces where you can actually see some of these things and map them out. Is that the right space?
I may.
Ms. Holton?
I like that approach. I would want the description to give a little guidance so that achievement and growth and graduation for high school be more heavily weighted than other criteria, and that growth be weighted at least as heavily as achievement. Those would be my proposed language. And recognizing those might be, others may have different views. And that last piece, that growth weighted at least as heavily for elementary, middle.
Dr. Coons?
So a model with some language behind it that you could react to. Okay, we can make that happen in March.
Yeah, actually, that's all I have on what we've covered so far. So now we're going into journey and ground that we have not covered as a board, and some important decisions on how the system folds up and rolls up together. Are we ready for that conversation? Anyone want to make any last comments on the components and weighting, et cetera?
Oh, sorry.
All right, let's go to slide 18, and this will sort of lay out where I'm going to try to
Hey,
take us.
Chad, I think maybe we might want to pause to see us maybe getting some modeling of what we're asking for next month before we jump in here and like further. What do you think?
Well,
Complicate the conversation? I don't know.
The challenge is modeling what? So we need to figure out what we're looking for exactly, and that's why some of this conversation would be helpful for us as a team to think through sort of what to bring back to you all. Are you worried about time? Like, because I could.
No, I think they're worried about capacity to think through
Yeah.
any
Well,
more spaces.
And I do like the direction that Dr. Siebert was going in with his sort of mapped out idea he had in his head of a visual type opportunity for us to then kind of move the chess pieces around, if you will, to where we want to see what it looks like, I guess. Is everybody, do you think we should keep going here, or do you think we need a little bit more of a map and then add,
Maybe,
please?
I think there's interesting content here, but I
Okay.
think maybe we should almost have it like as a show and tell, like priming our pump for future thoughts and again, if something jumps out and grabs us, but there's some slides here that intrigue me.
Mhm.
So I'd kind of like to have him motor through the next half of the
Okay.
presentation.
So let's go ahead and go through
That
it.
means we can't.
And
bag
then
them down.
maybe there's some comments at the end of what you're going through that we can add.
Yes. I can
Instead
try
of
to do that. I could also jump to
driving
key
you.
ones if you'd prefer that.
Just proceed however you wish.
All right. Well, the slide 18 sort of gives a framework for the topics that are still outstanding. So it's good to think through. Dr. Siebert's talk about the placemat or sort of how it all fits together. So we have this funnel of the different components, and they are going to go into a couple different decision points. One is on ratings, another is on identification of schools for supports, and then another is how it all folds into the accreditation system. Unless we get legislative change, the accountability system will have to live sort of within the accreditation system. They can feed and flow into that, and we can present some options for how that can look. But that is something that's still going to exist. So I'm going to jump to slide 23. And these define the types of identification. So which schools we have to identify. And they align pretty broadly with, I think, Virginians would want as well. The first is called comprehensive and support and improvement. This would be schools that need a large dose of improvement. They are the federal minimum is that they're the lowest performing 5% of all schools for all students. high schools with grad rates below 67% of all students. There aren't many of those in Virginia. And also schools that have persistent gaps that aren't able to close those gaps over time. And then the bottom list there is called targeted support and improvement. And those are schools with consistently underperforming groups of students. Sort of one of the options or one of the directions that we would like some feedback from the board is on slide 24, is how to start identifying schools for improvement and where to set various cut points. And there are 3 options here for you. The first option is to say, let's use a percentage-based system. We're going to say it's X% of schools are going to need support, and that's how many VDOE can support. And so that's how many schools we're going to identify. It's basically a normative ranking. And you say, I'm going to pick a percentage, say 10%, and you say all the schools in the bottom 10% get that support. The 11th percentile school and above does not get that support. So that's called what I call a normative-based system of how to define the schools that need support. Option 2 is what I would consider a standards-based system. This would be like defining a criteria or a point value and to say, here are the cut points of a different rating system. Probably the one you might be familiar with is like an A through F system of how to define which schools go into which categories. And that is, you have to identify a cut point. You need to do some modeling to figure out where those cut points make sense. But then you don't necessarily know where schools are going to land. You're saying it's a standard base, more like a rubric, and schools distribution falls where they may. Option 3 is sort of a hybrid approach. So we say in year 1, we're going to say we think we can support about this many types of schools. And then those are going to be the cut points going forward. So it's a way to transition into the system, but over time you lock in those cut points and say, that's how we're going to choose to set the cut points going forward. Those will be the cut points moving forward. Any questions or comments on that before I move forward onto other components?
Ms. Holton.
I'm not putting on. If yours is on, is yours on? No. Okay. Well, I bet it's hearing me from there, and that way it won't. So I think what our current system would be the standards based rather than the normative based. Is that right?
Yeah, I would say it's a standard based system.
Because
Yeah.
I think what I'm hearing is that right now we have, I mean, the 5% of comprehensive intervention schools is 5%, right? So we got 1,800 schools. That's 45 schools. But the lesser level of support, the targeted intervention, that can be a really high number. And I think it has grown a good bit. And frankly, unless and until we have resources in the Office of School Quality, well, right now they're inadequate. And sadly, for reasons I don't understand, the governor's proposed budget cuts 5 positions from our Office of School Quality rather than expanding it, as I think we had all hoped based on our conversations last year. We don't know what's going to happen in the General Assembly, but to me, to have schools in an intervention strategy status that we cannot support is serving no useful purpose. So I would like to say that we set use a normative when such that our staff can adequately support. So if we're supporting 5%, 45 schools in the comprehensive status, and that's essentially by federal definition, we don't have any flexibility over that. I would love to have see us support not more than another 5% in the targeted intervention strategy, just so that we can actually usefully provide some support. I mean, it doesn't mean anything if we can't do anything for them. And I would like to point out that unless our board recommendation about at-risk add-on comes through, or unless there's some other change in the budget, we are not sending extra resources to support these schools. And states that have actually moved the needle on the comprehensive support schools and the targeted support intervention schools have not just had money for an Office of School Quality Oversight component, but have actually sent real resources of a significant nature with oversight to those schools to help improve things. And until we get to that level, I'm not sure that we're really gonna move the needle the way we want it. It takes resources as well as scrutiny to make change. So all that to say, I would have us limit our TSI schools to a manageable number. And that's not meaning that there aren't other schools that need help. It's just that there, realistically, no need to commit to give help where we're not gonna do it.
Other comments?
All right, if we're sort of limited on time, the next one I would go to would be how to include student groups. So we have not talked about this at all. The system that we've talked about so far is overall totals across all students. So how to include student groups in ratings. So if you jump to slide 29, there's a couple options that are pretty common across states. Option 1 would be to rate schools based on all indicators for all groups of students. So essentially, combine the rating. And so if it's 40% overall for achievement, you divide it by each of the different subgroups that the school might have and add that up. So Black students, Hispanic students, students with disabilities are all getting a proportion that get added to the school total. So that's option 1. Option 2 there is to say, we're going to run the system for the different groups. And then if the groups are lower performing, we're going to lower the school's overall rating. And essentially a student group can then change the rating for the overall school's rating. So we have an example there of if it was meeting expectations or rated meeting expectations for the overall students, but there was a student group that was performing lower, then it would get bumped down to developing on the rating. Any feedback on either the percentage inclusion or more of a the bump sort of notion of option 2?
Dr. Siebert?
Hey, Chad, I'm gonna have to think about this a little bit more, but while slide 30 says it's the simpler approach, I immediately see, the decision rules. Well, you don't want a school that's meeting getting jumped to developing if the end or the percentage is so small, or did it happen over 2 years? So I definitely we need to be accountable for every child, and we need to be looking at every reporting group. So but I don't know if, the meeting to developing, I think then the question, there's gonna be a lot of debate over what are the triggers there. Was it just 1 year? Was it a 3-year rolling average? And now we're creating complexity again, which I want to try to avoid the complexity. So what can you tell us about the option 1 and what people are doing and what are the pros and cons?
Yeah, I would say it is less frequently adopted, option 1, but there have been some states that will choose a specific weight for subgroups to capture and say they're going to capture a certain percentage of the overall system. And then it gets broken down based on how many groups are meeting the qualifying threshold. So the sample size, the N size there determine how many different groups the school might have.
This might be an area where we need to really, for our stakeholder groups to inform. And yeah, this is an interesting chat. Thank you. I'm just not ready.
Am I right that currently we have a gap closing indicator that is a separate indicator from the others, an additional indicator of an additional switch that the divisions have to flip, using Dr. Siebert's analogy. But I think it is based just on reading and math. And I do think that using whatever we do in gap closing may be a way to simplify it, would be to continue that focus on reading. As long as that meets the federal requirements, which I assume it does because it works for us currently. For what it's worth.
Yeah, any other comments, feedback, guidance on things you want to make sure happen in either the school rating conversation or inclusion of student groups?
Question?
Yep. I mean, I think in general, just going back to your earlier point, President Creasy, which is like, what's the purpose of this? It's transparency. It is more information to make good decisions. And I think the timeline is year to year. Like kids don't have 5-10 years to go through 5th grade. So to the extent that there's transparency at the end of a year for a family, for a school division, that to me has to stay the purpose and not making it overly complicated. And I don't think in the charter world, it's no longer than 5 years. Like after 5 years of being persistently at the lowest end, that's where to me the greatest intervention or decision has to be made. And I think the other conversation around resources was a good one. And you could have a bad year, and that shouldn't be the end of the story. And so I think how we think about it over a period of time is important. So that's how we do that. I'm confident that you will figure that out, but that's where I end.
Dr. Northern?
I mean, this is another random comment, Chad, so I don't know if I'm answering your question, but when you ask about other groups that we're maybe concerned about, or want to see, I mean, we're going to have a conversation tomorrow about advanced learners, it looks like, and and we want to broaden the pipeline of advanced learners and how we make that pipeline more diverse and identify more of those kids who have promise and talent. So I would say, and other states do this, that we would have a subgroup of advanced learners, whether those, however we choose to define those, whether they're kids who've been identified through a formal process, whether they're kids who are in the top 5-10% of their school level distribution. I mean, however we want to do it. But I do think if again, we want to align our priorities with our system, that we ought to track somehow, some way, the needs of advanced learners, not just the needs of our of our low achievers. We want to track our high achievers too.
Anything else before we move on? We do have one more item on our agenda. Ms. Holton?
Just one quick follow-up to that one. I would love to see us tracking, and whether accountability is the right place to do it or not, I don't know, but how well are our schools doing at offering advanced options to students? Because that's one of the big questions. It's not how the students are doing on it, but they can't take an AP class if it's not offered. And at some point in our accountability system, we should be helping incentivize and encourage all of our schools to be offering more broadly, recognizing there's challenges of all sorts, but with virtual Virginia options, for instance, there's no reason they can't all offer AP classes. So if there's a way to think about moving in percentage of students offering opportunities of advanced courses, that might be an interesting measure. And then I had just two overall, this one may be minor, but thinking about this indicators we have now and what might be getting dropped. The gap closing you're addressing, looking at the gap closing indicator at science. So we do indicators in science in Virginia now. Are we going to include them?
Yeah, it would be included in the achievement index. So all the required tests would be included in that. Yeah.
Thank you. And then my last thing is just that, one of our big goals had been to separate out accreditation from accountability. There is no legislation that's been submitted to the General Assembly by anybody, as far as I can tell, that would achieve that goal this year. So whatever system we're adopting on the schedule we're talking about anyway, will be an accreditation system, not an accountability system by terminology. And so I guess my question would be, and this may be, we really need to hear from council at some point, what can we do? What flexibility do we have within our current legal structure to call this something different than accredited with conditions, for instance? But in other words, I think a good bit of our current system is embedded in the statute. How is that going to be reconciled with what we're talking about doing? That doesn't have to be today, but at some point. No, I didn't mean that. I didn't mean to put you on the spot for today, but at some point we need some of that.
Dr. Siebert.
And I think Chad's slide number 31 really kind of tees up that conversation for us. And in terms of, you know, we're probably gonna have to work within some pretty narrow guardrails in the coming year. And as we do that, and as we develop some really, really good ideas, I think that informs the legislative ask for the next session. But yeah, I think, Chad, you've got that there on slide 31. Any key observations you'd share with us, even though we're out of gas?
Yeah, I mean, Ms. Holden is correct that the accreditation system would still exist. We'll work with the legal counsel to make sure that everything is compliant. I think at this point, we would anticipate that there is a way to create an accountability system that feeds into the accreditation. So you could still think of them as two things. But accountability is the subcomponent of accreditation. Accreditation would still exist. All the existing, most of the existing rules would still exist, but the accountability portion would be siphoned off and sort of a subset of that. The last thing I will say is just to say we're hoping to be back in March. We'll have some data runs for you all to look at. I think we'll have some more advanced text for you all to look at and react to. It'll build on some of the things that we covered, as well as things that we didn't fully dive into. It's more time for that. And then after that, we're planning for another round of stakeholder feedback. So once we have that more fleshed out system, feedback from you all, we would go back out to the field for additional feedback.
Dr. Coons.
That, of course, we won't go out for feedback until you guys are ready for us to present something.
That's right.
So if we come back in March and you're like, we need one more bite of the apple before the timeline is dependent on what y'all feel comfortable with us moving forward. I just want to reiterate that we have an aggressive timeline and we can slow that timeline down to make sure that we are meeting what you guys need us to meet so that you feel confident with those decisions before we would go out with any models.
Dr. Northern.
I'm just curious what these data runs are going to be.
Well, definitely some indicator level data runs. So we
Okay.
can do that on something like the mastery index on growth. We're hoping to have more on some of the readiness type of indicators.
Okay.
And the rolling up together depends on what we think is worth modeling out at this point. Yeah.
Thank you, Chad.
Thanks. Yeah. Thank you.
All right. Do we want to take a break for us to then come back and dive in the work plan? So 7 minutes. Okay. Enough time to walk the other side of the building.
Great job, Chad.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we are back. And we are moving on to the last item on our work session agenda today, which is the discussion on the board work plan. Who's driving this discussion? We are.
Mhm.
All right.
You want me to
So,
overview the document?
yes, please.
So in the conversations in November and December around the annual plan, Dr. Northern, you asked us to create a work plan. Our team took a stab at a work plan. And you asked us to make the work plan around the priorities in the annual plan. Or in the 5-year comprehensive plan. So this is probably not what anyone wants exactly. This is a starting point document and you will see draft in dark bold letters on the top on purpose because we roughed out some ideas and are really looking forward to you tearing apart this document and giving us really good recommendations on how you want us to move forward. And so the 3 department members left in the room are happy to take notes on your recommendations so that we can build a version 2 on the work plan for you. So I'm gonna turn it over to you.
Comments? This is our work plan. Happy to facilitate discussion here. So, let's get into it. What can we do? Ms. Holton?
So I know we're all brain fried. I certainly am. But just gonna try to turn that one. But when I do a work, when I would love to see us do a work plan where we think first expansively about. I love how this is organized around our priorities. And I would also like to see us say, well, what are all the things we actually just have to do this year because we have to do them. And then even if it's a really cluttered work, even if it's really full, over full, perhaps, then we can at least have something we can look at and then deal with the pressure points. So, and I would also love to have us suggest that it go through a full year. So I like starting in March since we're talking, we won't adopt it before March, but that if we could take it March through March, just to give us a year's window. So little things like we know we have to do an annual report, as we actually are required to do an annual report. So we know if we're gonna get started on it in a reasonable amount of time, that we would want that presented to us in an initial discussion at least by September, and then October, we could look at a draft, and November we adopt it. I don't know if those are the right months, but something like earlier. Well, then, okay, yeah, maybe we want to start it in July, or, yeah. So, and that will also help on, we're not gonna have a special meeting in August, and we know we need it. If September isn't early enough, then we know we need it in July. So just thinking about, what are the things we know we have to do? And one I saw that right up with an annual report, but also, don't we have to do this year? I don't know how we're gonna do this. Hopefully your amazing staff is gonna help us, but we have to do SOQs for school construction, whatever that means. And whatever it is, it's big and new and nothing like anything we've ever done. And therefore, I would like to have us start on that, if it's due to the General Assembly by November 1, then we want to start on that by, June, maybe? I mean, I know we Hence mentioned it, but we
So-
haven't actually seen any.
We have a work group working on it right now. There's no one in the room on that work group, but we have a work group working on that. So we'd be happy to this is really helpful that these are the kinds of things you want to see mapped out. Do you want them on this big overarching space? Do you want it all to be cluttery? Or do you want something that dives into layers?
What I would like, what would be most useful to me is have a calendaring system such that we can see, oh my gosh, July's got a lot on it. So is there any, if we see all the July things in July, then we can go, oh, we gotta move some of that to June or some of that to September.
So I think too, what are some of the statutory obligations as far as reports and such that we have, and we need to give those whatever those things are, whether it's, well, whatever it is, needs at least, 3 months before the due date, we need to be presented with it. Obviously dependent upon how, technical we need to get with the document. But I think at the very least, we need to have it 3 months ahead.
And that's for the ones that are ours as
Right.
opposed to.
Correct.
Now, there may be some that the general assemblies this year are going to tell the department that the board should. I mean, if they tell the department, that's a different thing, but if they tell us this year that we have to do something, I know kind of, which they do, but so when 3 months is, but I think she's right that 3 months is a good norm to strive towards where doable. Another thing I would want to put on the calendar is thinking about what are the things we're going to need formal public hearings on, because that's scheduling when you all are, God bless Jim, trying to help us all manage our personal calendars to be all across the Commonwealth. And so I know that we're going to need, presumably, we're going to need to be out there again at some point on accountability and accreditation, depending on when science, that what we saw earlier suggested that we're going to approve final science SOPs in SOLs, in January 2025 would mean we need to do public hearings in the fall on science, which I would suggest maybe a little ambitious, but laying it out there in the chart will help us decide if that's doable or not. So what else do we need to do public hearings on? There's about all that regulatory work we saw last time. We saw that list of things that we're going to be looking at reviewing quite a few of our regulations. And I assume that those require public hearings, and maybe they can be combined, but they don't require public hearings. Yeah. That's good. But the periodic reviews require us to look at things. So when is that going to be in the chart, or is that going to be throughout the year?
Dr. Siebert?
No, I like this as a starting point. It's always easier to start with something to look at than a blank sheet of paper. So thank you for putting something down. For example, I think it makes sense that we're looking at the priorities from our plan. And so, but I think some additional rows, for example, look at priority 1, higher expectations. I like that we have the English standards on there, and we have our accountability discussion on there. But some of those things, those two in particular, are going to run a much longer stretch of time. So it's almost, those could become their own rows. We could have our accountability conversation as a row across the bottom, so we could know when we're going out for informal feedback versus when we're doing things. And then the same with and the same with the standard. Yeah, and that's a chance for Jim to plop in some NORA things that we might need to. But no, this is a really good start.
So I challenge us to, yes, on all the regulatory stuff, all the things that we got to do, align it to the comprehensive plan. But what I'd like to do is really hear from, start integrating, like teachers do, our guiding questions for a board meeting, so just to time with what we're struggling with. So, a big question, maybe how do states how do states develop their high quality CTE pathway programs? Or, who should we, what non-test score measures should we be considering for our accountability system? So we have a guiding question that's sort of, going to be at least a focus, a part of the meeting. And then we use that to then start thinking about who we want to ask to present. So both state and districts, like our schools. So I think we all love hearing and hearing our schools and our districts and what they're doing. And I know they love getting attention for their work. So if we had somebody doing some great CTE thing and our guiding question is, how do we make better CTE pathways? Then they would present that meeting. Or if we had an expert from Colorado who's doing phenomenal things around CTE pathways, then we would know 3 months in advance, hey, let's ask the Colorado expert to this meeting. So I guess what I'm trying to do is come up with sort of a big picture guiding question, like a lesson would be structured around. Not that it's going to perfectly fit everything, because it won't, but maybe it's just, 2 hours of the work session is devoted to this question, something like that. Because I know we can't just have a question run for 2 days. But yeah, use it as an opportunity to problem solve. Like we've got some really meaty questions and debates, and like this chronic absenteeism thing just kind of turned into that. But we could easily see a guiding question for today's meeting could have been like, what are the pros and cons to using chronic absenteeism, or whatever. And then we could have, heard from districts. We could have heard from a state that's got attendance value added, whatever. So you get my larger point, which is just to have a guiding question and then use that as an opportunity to hear from our districts that are doing cool things and other states.
Yeah, and I would
Ms.
think
Halton?
that particularly applies to the work, we can use our work sessions and our retreat day. We do have that one day in April where we have more flexibility, where we're not necessarily having to vote on agenda items, but to use the sort of, to try to use our guiding, to have a list of things we know we want to hear about over the course of time, and use the work sessions and the retreat day to address those, like the CTE. Can I ask one? I see computer science standards is on for June. Are the computer science standards due for their regular 7-year update this year?
Wow.
Okay, so that means we have to have them on means we have the opportunity to review them for initial review, and then we have to do public hearings on them, and then we do a final. That's, that's. Well, are the computer science coming on for first review in April, or not until? So final, we're hoping for in June. Whew, okay, so that means public hearings in May. So maybe, we're gonna have public hearings on that. We're gonna have public hearings on accreditation accountability. Do we have to do public hearings on the SOQ for buildings, or? I don't know. The construction. In other words, maybe think about, are there ways to combine some of those public hearing requirements?
This is a good call.
We are the hardest working board in not just the Commonwealth, the nation, I would say.
I did say that Tuesday morning. I did say
Thank
that
you.
to the VSBA. I said, no, I have. The state board is the hardest working on the state board, but you guys are awesome too.
Miss Ashton?
Call the question again, like, what is the purpose? And I know we asked for it, so I
So I'm asking you.
Yeah.
What I'm asking you.
So I think originally I thought that it was just to understand I haven't been here a whole year, so every day, every board meeting feels completely brand new to me. Although I'm starting to see some themes, and the work that the team does to send us information, prepare us, is like amazing. And so I think of my job as helping to shape policy of the state of Virginia when it comes to education, and to give feedback and advise the leadership and staff so that we can get what we need to make policy. I think that's kind of summarizing our jobs. So then in this document could get really big and really clunky. I think there's a lot of other documents that tell me the rules and regs and procedures, because I don't want to get lost in procedures. I would want to make sure that I know what's coming down the pike maybe it's just a year in advance. Like, we know science are coming, we know computer science is coming, we know math is coming in terms of policy, but getting too far out and too far behind this feels like this is actually more work for the staff to do, which I would really be against. And I like the question around, like, well, what's the priority? Is there a focus? It doesn't feel like that's the way the work happens, though. It feels like we are kind of constantly
Reacting.
turning, which is great because we have all the information, but then there's sometimes we're like, oh, we just wish we had a little bit more. So I'm just going to call the question again. I think this does what we asked you all to do, but I would just push us on the like, to what end? Like, what do we really, if a year from now, because we had this, we were a better group, what would be in here? Again, I'm halfway, not even halfway through my first year. So.
You're amazing for,
Yes.
you don't get to do that. I'm new here anymore.
I'm very new.
Dr. Northern?
I was just gonna answer a question. Just speaking from my own point of view, because I still do feel new, is that I get a lot out of hearing from, and I know the staff here get to hear from school districts all the time about the cool things that are going on in our state. And I personally feel like that's one thing I miss on a board. Like, and I think to elevate those voices in a public meeting like this, so folks can hear across the state, would be one thing that I feel like would be helpful in terms of being able to plan for that ahead and how it's tied into our work. And also just hearing from other states. I feel like we learned tremendous. I mean, when I was on the assessment HB 585, and one thing that the department did in structuring that was bringing in experts from other states, and we learned a ton from that. So I'm just saying, trying to integrate that model in our meeting, I think will improve our work. Both the sharing, I mean, again, those are the primary things I was looking for, is the sharing of the district ideas and the national and other state experts. And also sometimes I feel like we're, by virtue of the nature of the work, we're in reaction mode. And it'd be nice sometimes if I felt like personally that it was a little bit of being proactive and not always reactive. That's just me though.
So I think, as far as what I'm thinking about in terms of school divisions sharing out what they are doing, that's really amazing work, which all of them are doing in some form or fashion. I really appreciated the fact that Louisa and Mr. Straley came to do their presentation on chronic absenteeism and the amazing things that they're doing there. And so perhaps it's an opportunity for us to look at, whatever other kinds of issues that we have, coming up, like Dr. Coons, you guys have launched this Office of Behavioral Health and Wellness. Is there a school division that's really blowing it out of the water on that? That we could hear from, that would, really actually maybe energize us in our work? Because I don't know about y'all, but I felt very energized when my neighbor, Mr. Straley, came to give us all of his good things that are going on there. And so I think these opportunities that we have, then again, I see like an innovation conference. Maybe there's something really awesome, that's uber innovative that we can hear from. I don't know, I'm looking at some of these other things that are on just this particular list here.
Well, I think that's what we were hoping to kind of solidify these big buckets.
Yep.
And then to Dr. Northern's point, we can put a question around these big buckets and then bring a presentation, or, depending on the topic, is it a national or is it a local? But what would be helpful for us is got it. We need to have the or the, regulatory, the annual report, the kind of extra buckets there. Her lines need to be delineated out. But what we were trying to do is get a little bit at what Dr. Northern was, is kind of bucket. Okay, so these are these big priorities. So what is the guiding question? And then we can definitely add in some of these elements, but does the overarching flow of the big buckets so that we can come back and then put some guiding questions and add in some school presentations. We can do all of the things you guys are talking about, but what we tried to do in this document was at least take your 6 priorities, break them out into areas. We're happy to come back then, add that guiding question for some of those pieces. I think, Ms. Holton, your point about April, we get an extra month. So is that like a whole day on getting the accountability ready to go out the door, right? Like, very helpful feedback. But what we actually tried to do was bucket these into those kind of places. So you'll see in July, everything about elevating educators. You'll see something about licensure, I teach, grow your own, teaching grant updates, end of year staffing, principal mentorship. We can definitely have a school division come and talk about some of those things. Is this the right rhythm
Yeah.
that you're seeing? And then we can wrap these details that you're talking about. Those are really helpful.
So I think, Michelle, your question about what the purpose is absolutely crucial to what the outcome is. And I think it is both enabling us to get the balance on, aim towards balance on proactive versus reactive. But that means we do need to have the priorities in and the sort of mandated responsibilities in. And then, so to me, the goal is for, it's a planning document that we can use for our own scheduling, but also for the board scheduling so that the agendas don't get too bunched up one month and then we have spare time another month. Not that we ever had spare time, but also so we can try and make sure that our agendas do reflect our priorities. And the one thing I would say is thinking, one lens I would use is making sure you're focusing on the things that the board does have action points on. So one of our core responsibilities that we are the be all and end all on is the SOLs, the content standards. So that is something that we, it's right that we spend a lot of time on. But to think, okay, if we're going to do computer science if we're aiming to try to finalize in June, then that means that with April, we need to be at least initial review at least by April, and we need to be figuring out how to do public hearings in May. So that's sort of for scheduling, planning purposes, both thinking about our core responsibilities and our priorities. Well, and I would say on the SOLs, one of our core things is we got the first review, we do final review, we do textbooks, we do assessment, cut scores at some point. We don't do curriculum framework anymore. That is, there's sort of standard steps along the process for each of our different content areas. And it's not just math, science, reading, and history in Virginia. It is arts and computer science, et cetera, et cetera. So they're all on a 7-year cycle. And, when we accelerate one or slow down another, I do have questions, for instance, the history. Okay, we adopted the history standards in the spring, and then we basically heard very little about them since then. Are we going to do textbook adoption? Presumably, we are going to do some textbook adoption consistent with the new history standards this year. I think I have heard informally, I don't know if maybe it's in the church formally, but that the history standards are now going to be rolled out. They're basically the slip behind the literacy and math, so they won't be rolled out until 25, 26. But what does that need? What do we need to do before then? We need to textbooks, and let's not wait till we're behind the gun on textbooks. Let's do it at the right time. So we have enough time for school divisions to be able to go do those purchases. And then when we need to, I don't think we actually have much of a role in the assessment other than setting cut scores, but that is our role. So anyway, those, again, that would be some of our core responsibilities is the SOLs. And certainly the accountability accreditation is part of our core responsibility too.
Madam President,
Please.
the beauty of this board, I've come to conclude, like these two, I feel new a lot of times, is that we have such differing opinions, but yet they all work so well together. Because when Amber was talking earlier, I was thinking exactly what you were thinking. I loved when Louisa came. I love being proactive instead of always being reactive. But then when you ask the question, what's the purpose? That was good too, but you're putting it in perspective. I mean, what are we doing here? And I had a professor in college a long time ago. He used to say, don't reinvent the wheel. And that's what I'm talking about. Don't reinvent the wheel. That is native and sometimes I think it's weird. But that's what I think about when I think about having schools come and share with us their success stories. Because, and I'm probably the one most recently in the classroom, I don't know, I might be wrong, but I think it's really easy to quickly get attached, and even if you did, teach school or did whatever, but to get attached from the classroom and what teachers are doing on a daily basis. And a lot of success stories. And so I'm I'm just adding on what everybody's saying. A lot of times I don't forget, half times when I see something, I already think of the why repeat it, but I see both, I appreciate both of them. Something to me work good. Why are we here? But then let's be more proactive and somehow that kind of mesh together with what our purposes are. With this.
Please, Dr. Siebert.
I think that's great observations. My next thing would just be to differentiate some of those. So the idea of a featured division, that's great, but I think that should also fit into whatever topic we're on, just like chronic absenteeism. Louise, that was a good example. Also, I don't know if we want to get into, I don't want to limit ourselves that the only way to feature a division is to bring the whole division in. It could also be, here's a one pager from 3 divisions on a topic. Please use this as part of your agenda prep. I think that there's ways to differentiate that. Similarly, I like the idea of hearing what other states are doing, but our time is so precious. I've kind of liked the experts have come in and one expert has told us what 6 states are doing. I kind of appreciate that meta analysis of what states are doing, to me, would probably be a little more appealing than individuals. And then I also, Dr. Coons, I encourage you to look at the things that you've already done for us that maybe we haven't given due credit to. I'm sure some of us have, scanned through the special ed reports that you commissioned, that you had prepared, but it's something like that. Knowing that there's 2 big omnibus special ed bills coming through the General Assembly right now, it would probably be proactive for us to be thinking about some of the things you've already gathered for us. So no, I think this is great. I'd just like to link to the big topic. How we feature a division or a school could vary. And I like to hear about lots of states whenever possible.
And I wrote this, like, we want to have insights from the field, whether it's local or national, constantly woven in. We want to have a big question. And I think the thing that I heard and want to emphasize is, like, I actually want to hear the results too. And that's like, we implemented something. How is it going? We did a whole accountability system. What are the results of it? And so somehow it's like, because we're doing so much, and sometimes it doesn't have to be a presentation, but it could be hey, this just happened, read it. We'll come back to it. A follow-up. Yeah.
That's actually one of the things we push on. So if you look at priority 2, it has an all-in update, a learning recovery data reporting, a learning recovery year 2. That was the hope, was to kind of create this rhythm so that you could come back. Because I do feel, and you guys have said to me, we never heard back on that. So we tried to create some of a rhythm, in particular around your priority expectations, so that there's this cyclical piece of that. So we come back and talk about it. So for example, you've got innovation on priority 4, then it's okay. So here's a broader update. Here's an update. So we were trying to start to create that rhythm. Like you'll see, here's the launch of the behavioral office. Here's what the office is doing. And then why don't we give you some updates in November? So we were trying to kind of start picking that up. So I hope as you guys kind of look through, you'll see some of that rhythm and cycle was in hopes to do that.
Yeah, that's great.
Yep.
Okay. Well, I think that we have a direction, and
Summarize.
please.
I'm just going to summarize to make sure, because sometimes I walk away and I think I hear what you said, but I want to make sure. So there's definitely this lovely balance, as Debbie put it, between the scheduling and the planning and making sure that we're getting proactive with some of our things, like our action points, our SOLs, our stakeholder engagement, things like that. Making sure too that we have these themes with the guiding questions that we can spend a portion of our work session on, and potentially either have a school district presentation, 1-pagers from school divisions, but connecting it to the work in Virginia, but also connecting it to the national landscape versus a particular state in general, if that's possible. And then making sure that the things that the board has priorities and responsibilities over, whether it's standards, textbooks, things like that, that those are clearly evident and woven throughout. Anything else that I've missed that you've requested as we move for our work plan in March?
Did you say the public hearings? I'm sorry.
Yeah, the public engagement, yep. So
Take it to a year.
yeah, March to March, yes. What we will do is we'll try to put something together and then send it out midterm and get you guys to redline it, and then you can give us feedback. So probably dependent on how busy we are in the next few weeks. We get that to you early, mid-February, and then get your feedback and then have the opportunity to get it posted. Great, thanks. Appreciate the feedback.
All right, do you have anything else before we close for the day? Okay, and council has encouraged us to adjourn for the day. We are adjourned.